This is also my first time in a Zoom debate room. I have experience POing, but I've been in tab room all season, so I haven't had the opportunity to see debate on Zoom. So I hope I do a decent job. Feel free if you have any questions or comments or think that something is not the way you think it should be, to make a point of parliamentary inquiry or send me a chat or something to let me know. Before we officially vote on the docket, I just wanted to give the judges an opportunity to introduce themselves, tell you what school they're from, tell you a little bit about what they'll be looking for today as they evaluate your speeches. And so I'm just going to go in the order that I see people. Mr. Maskey.
Hi, everybody. Congratulations. And I'm Mike Maskey from Addison Trail. I've had a lot of you in the past and looking forward to some good debate. So just make sure you're having fun and you're being professional with each other as we go through the debate today.
Miss Krulowicz.
Hi, everybody. Congratulations. This has been such a really incredible year. Many of you have had to basically relearn a whole different sort of set of skills. And I've been consistently impressed at how amazing all of you have been. You've made it to finals at IHSA, so you already are amazing. Congratulations. And at this point, I'm looking for you to just have a celebration of debate and be kind competitors to each other. I think everything else you probably already know.
Mr. Carter.
Congratulations, all. This is going to be a wonderful opportunity for me to see your greatness. Go ahead and have a great time framing that argument and supporting your argument with your evidence. I'm looking forward to having a great time. Thank you.
Mr. Smith.
Good afternoon and congratulations, everyone. I'm specifically looking for some specific direct refutations, particularly if you're able to weigh why one point is better than the other and explain why. Those are the ones that stand out most to me. So good luck and congratulations.
Ms. Heller.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations. You're all amazing. I am a judge from Stevenson. And yeah, just to echo the previous judge, specific reputations. And I also really appreciate when the speech feels organic in its delivery and just in its content, like it's, responding to what is actually happening around it. So good luck. Thank you.
I have been rearranging pictures on my screen, so now I kind of got out of order. Is Ms. Gomez Rios? I haven't called on you yet, right?
No, this is the first time.
Okay.
So hi, first of all, congratulations to all of you, especially the seniors. You guys made it. Nice job. Very similar to what Mr. Smith said. I really like weighing impacts, reputation. This is a debate, so that's something I'm really looking forward to.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, is that all the judges? Did I miss anybody?
I'm still here.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Hi, I'm Amy Lovey. I'm from Barrington High School. I'm just excited that we were able to figure out a way to do this year and give all of you this opportunity. So have a great time, listen to each other, and let's have some fun.
Great. Before I get started, I know that all of the judges, just the judges, are supposed to have a copy of the final round chamber. It includes the speaking order. Is there any judge who does not have that file shared with them?
I don't know that I have it.
Mr. Carter and Ms. Lovey? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I need to have that.
Can I have it as well, please?
So I'm going to chat that to you real quickly. I need to make sure Mr. Ken Carter and Miss Lovey. All right, so the judges are also going to kind of make sure I am following the speaking order that has been preordained. I'm not the one who determines that. And then I also want to share with all of you, oh, I'm sorry, one more person didn't have it. Okay. Now all the judges, I hope, have the speaking order. The other thing I needed to share, this is again something that's new to me, but in lieu of a marker board, I am going to have a document going with the docket and who has spoken. If there's anything else that you would like me to include on it, feel free to let me know. But I'm going to send that out in a chat to everyone so that everyone has it and can see what I'm seeing. Okay. Before we vote on the docket, let me just tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. Again, I said that the speaking order has been pre-established. It's nothing that I have control over. So it might take me a little bit of time to figure out who has the floor so that I can look and see the order that it's on here. As far as questioning, we have two 30-second questioning periods after each speech. I will try to keep that as equal as possible so that no one gets way more questioning opportunities than another person. However, there is no pre-established order for that. It's something that I will, based on clash and recency and things like that, kind of at my own leisure. As far as time signals, I'm guessing most of you are timing yourselves at home, but I will put up a 2:30 when there's 2 minutes and 30 left. I'll put up a 2:45 when there's, excuse me, not 2:30 left, when you're at 2:30. And then a 2:45 when you're at 2:45. And then we are going to do a hard stop at 3 minutes. So I will just cut you off and thank you for your speech and call on questioners at exactly 3 minutes. So please be aware of that. There's not going to be a grace period. I don't want anyone to feel like they were cheated out of that. It'll be fair to everyone. Everyone will have the exact same amount of time to speak. So just be clear. The other thing I wanted to mention as far as questioning, when I call on questioners, I will call on two questioners at the same time. I'll say who's going to go first. And then at the end of 30 seconds, I will just say the name of the next questioner and mute whoever is talking and tell the next questioner that they can begin. Are there any other questions about how I am going to run the chamber or how anything I'm doing is going to happen? Okay, seeing no questions. Let me scroll back up in the chat. We have one proposed docket on the floor, and that docket is Bill 101, Bill 201, Bill 302, and Bill 301. I'll go ahead and put that in as a possible docket. Is there any other people who would like to propose a docket? All right, then it seems as if it may be a unanimous vote. So let me just ask everyone who's in favor of that docket to raise their placard. And it looks unanimous, so we will use that docket. So the first bill off the docket today is Bill 101. If there are no objections, I will waive the reading of this bill. Seeing none.
Point of inquiry real quick.
Yes.
We forgot to do splits earlier. I think just to make sure that the debate goes smoothly, that might be a good idea. Would it be okay for us to just pause real quick and get those in?
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. So starting with Bill 101, the first one we were planning to debate, can all affirmative speakers please raise their placards? Okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh my. All negative speakers? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, we're gonna need some negative speakers to flip to the affirmative on this one. And then on the second bill we were planning on debating, because we were gonna table the 201, 302 on mandatory voting. All affirmative speakers, please raise your placards. Oh my, okay. Oh, okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 affirmative speakers. All negative speakers, raise your placards. Okay, so once again, we're gonna need some of our negative speakers, quite a few to flip on that bill. But yeah, glad we knew that because these splits are not super even. Anyway, we can proceed.
All right, so again, first bill off the docket will be Bill 101. If there are no objections, I'll waive the reading of this bill. Seeing none, I will call for a speaker in affirmation. If you would like to speak, please raise your placard. Representative Fay, you have the floor. Give me 1 second to get my timer going. Okay, Representative Fay, whenever you're ready.
This is Representative Fay speaking for the first time this legislative session. As always, I'm at the leisure of my PO and judges. Please give me any indication when you're ready. shortcut. When someone pays into Social Security, it's done with the promise that the government will pay them back with benefits when their time has come. But understand that this promise is being broken. A staggering 8 out of 10 millennials don't expect Social Security support when they retire. However, today's legislation, Bill 101, offers a solution. Understand that we must stand in the affirmation of today's legislation, which removes the payroll tax cap for 2 primary reasons. The first is that we extend the solvency of Social Security. And the second is that by doing so, we keep millions of Americans out of poverty. But before that, let's establish the actual problem that's being addressed by today's legislation. Specifically, according to the Congressional Budget Office, after taking into account the effect of COVID-19 on the economy, they state that Social Security's trust funds is set to run out very soon. Specifically, the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Fund is set to run out by 2030, and the Disability Insurance Fund is set to run out by 2026. Here's how today's legislation addresses this issue, because under Section 1, it specifically states that we're going to be removing the payroll tax cap. That means that every single dollar that's being earned by every single American is going to be taxed at the current 6.2% rate. Here's how that's beneficial, because we extend the solvency of Social Security because we're earning more money. Specifically, according to the Social Security Administration, in February of 2017, they state that just raising the earnings cap to $250,000 means that we extend the year of the projected reserve depletion for the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Fund and the Disability Insurance Fund to 2078. That is nearly 6 decades of time that we're going to be able to pay the benefits on time for Americans. That means that the people with disabilities who need this money are going to receive it, and the elderly who need this money for their retirement plans are going to receive it as well. We are ensuring the financial stability of millions of Americans by affirming today's legislation and ensuring the longevity and solvency of Social Security. But next, let's understand that affirming today's legislation also keeps millions of our constituents out of poverty because they rely on Social Security. Specifically, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in February of 2020, without Social Security, a staggering 21.7 million more Americans would be under the poverty line. Specifically, this includes 6.9 million Americans who are under the age of 65, and it also includes 1.2 million children. And this is especially important for both elderly women and people of color, because outside of Social Security, they have few retirement options. Understand that the money that we're ensuring that goes into the pockets of these Americans keeps them out of poverty, puts a roof over their heads, and allows them to put food on their tables. That's what we're ensuring when we remove the payroll cap tax under today's legislation. Stand with me on the affirmation of Bill 101 to ensure that our constituents are able to receive the money that they paid into. Stand with me on the affirmation of Firm Bill 101. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, for that 2-minute and 56-second speech. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Ramachandra and Representative Wu.
Hi, Representative.
Hi.
So what nature of how payroll taxes are used to fund Social Security ensures that we're actually going to be giving enough funding to the specific areas that you talk about, like benefiting like elderly people and children?
Right. So specifically, the way it works is that when the amount of income that we receive from payroll taxes each year, we deduct the cost of actually paying out the benefits for Social Security. The surplus is invested into the trust fund. Currently, we're essentially, basically this year, we're going to be running at a deficit. So the amount of money we earn from Social Security income is not going to be enough to actually cover. Is going to cover
Representative
benefits.
Wu.
Thank you. Why does the payroll tax cap exist in the first place?
So it's specifically to stop any income above, I believe right now it's like $140,000 from being taxed at the 6.2%.
Well, the reason you have a cap on taxes is because there's also a maximum cap on the benefits you can receive, right? So let's talk about the benefit structure. If high income earners are paying more into this program, are they getting more out of it?
I believe so, yeah.
How? How does this legislation change the amount of benefits that earners are getting?
Okay,
Thank
so
you,
if they're going-
Representative. That is all of the time that we have. Seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for speakers in negation. Speakers in negation, please raise your placards. Representative Kumar, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. This is Representative Kumar, spelled Kumar, speaking for the first time today. As always, to my judges and PO, just let me know when you're ready. Okay, let me look. Are all my judges ready? Okay, thank you. Sorry. Hope, a word that so many Americans have learned to rely on during a crisis that has torn families, jobs, and homes apart. Along with hope, those most vulnerable have looked to our leaders to create change. But I will not stand in the affirmation of a legislation that leaves more and more hardworking Americans behind. So I will be negating for the following two reasons: that today's legislation will disincentivize work, and because we would struggle to raise money for programs that we truly need. The first reason you negate is because today's legislation will incentivize hardworking Americans to stop working by increasing the amount of money that they pay in taxes. Under the status quo, the Congressional Budget Office explains in December of 2018 that the decline in after-tax earnings, if we remove the cap, would have two opposing effects. On the one hand, the lower earnings for each additional hour worked would make other uses of time relatively more attractive, so people would tend to work for fewer hours. On the other hand, people also would tend to work for more hours because having less after-tax income requires additional work to maintain the same standard of living. On balance, the CBO estimates that the first effect in which less people work because they're disincentivized to do so, would be greater than the second effect, and thus people in those earning ranges would work less. If we pass today's legislation, we increase the amount of taxes we take out of an employee's income, incentivizing them to work less in order to avoid more taxes. But understand the impact. The disincentive to work that would result primarily in high-wage earners pulls our economy further and further down the drain. The very economy that Representative Fay tells us has been ravaged by a pandemic. Brookings tells us in October of last year that in order to revive our economy, encouraging consumer spending is the key. But when we pass this legislation, we disincentivize working, thereby decreasing disposable income and the ability of Americans to spend their money. In a time when the American people look to us for guidance, in a time when they rely on us to create change, we cannot afford to leave more and more people unemployed as they struggle to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. But the second reason you negate is because uncapping the payroll tax would make it harder to raise tax revenue for other programs by introducing a new tax on earners. Representative Fay is missing the point in his speech. I agree that Social Security is depleting, but understand that the problem here isn't the payroll tax. The problem is that we don't have enough young workers to continue fueling the sustainability of our elderly population. But today's legislation works against that, because as the Washington Post explains in May of 2019, uncapping Social Security will make it more difficult for the government to raise money to pay for things like infrastructure, education, and social programs that we need to help younger people and prepare our country for the future. When you pass this legislation, you ignore that problem, instead making it worse by punishing the young people of this country, the people who ensure our future and take care of our elderly. We push them farther and farther behind. Representative Fay, again and again, you missed the mark. We must negate.
Thank you, Representative, for that 2-minute and 59-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placard. Representative Fay and Representative Reddy.
Okay, hi, Representative. Is the average income for an American individual above or below the current cap that we've set?
It is usually below.
Okay, so then the average American isn't going to be paying an increased amount of taxes under today's legislation, right?
Correct.
Okay, so then how can you say that when we uncap Social Security, we harm the government's ability to fund projects for young people specifically?
Okay, so as I explained in my first contention, today's legislation will mostly impact high-wage earners who use more of their disposable income to spend. And when you spend, you give a lot of your tax revenue to the government, who then uses
Representative
that to fund
Reddy.
Hi, so these high wage earners, which is like 140K upwards, who are going to be most impacted, they're going to work less and somehow maintain their same standard of living.
Correct, because if they're being taxed high, it acts as a disincentive for them to not work.
But then how do they maintain that same standard of living? Because they need an income, right?
Correct, they do need an income, but today's legislation motivates them to stop working because they're giving more of their money away.
Okay, so then maybe it's their businesses.
Thank you,
and they're
Representative.
employing more people.
Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I'm now going to call for a speech in affirmation. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. Representative Representative Shetty, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Representative Shetty, spelled Shetty, if that helps anyone. As always, the PO and judges, please let me know when you're ready for me to begin. Social Security is the most important safety net we have, but over time, the net's holes have widened. This Congress has considered everything, from changing the fabric to the color of the net, everything but patching the holes. Bill 101 finally provides us with a long-term solution, something we need now. It's time we pass for change. First, let's examine how the hole in Social Security is widening. Representative Kumar tells us that if we pass, we disincentivize working, but this paints a false narrative. I turn to Virginia Reno, who is the founder of a National Academy of Social Insurance. In 2012, she explains that since these high earners don't pay Social Security taxes on all of their earnings, their effective Social Security tax rates are lower, and sometimes drastically lower than the rate paid by workers below the cap. For instance, a worker earning only $120,000 pays an effective Social Security tax rate of 5.7%, but one making $2.5 million pays only 0.33%. Ms. Kumar, the people who are already overworking are contributing too much. And we remember, we've raised taxes in the past, and there was no major net loss of unemployment. If anything, high-income earners will still work more to make up the difference. The impact is that we have to take urgent action. Remember what Representative Faye tells us, that without action, we risk depleting the funds by 2035. This is one of the most important points on today's bill because it forces us to debate this value on a framework of time. We have to stop expecting our low-income constituents, the one who are most dependent on these funds, to pay more because the net is about to snap. The affirmation has now identified two problems that give us a warrant to act. But let's delve deeper into why this bill is the best solution, which leads me to my second contention, that eliminating the payroll tax cap closes the holes in these nets. Representative Faye demonstrates that we could see financial solvency for as long as 2078. Now, future representatives on the negation may claim that we don't solve the root problem because we don't fix Social Security and that dependents might not get full benefits. But realize we still have the impact of a long-term solution. The Congressional Research Service furthers that we could have solvency for over 40 years. Given the number of times we've debated on Social Security bills, it's nearly impossible we will ever reach a perfect solution. Sacrifices have to be made. Any counterplans given by the speakers on the negation can still go through in a different bill. In fact, since we have that buffer time of over 40 years, we still have more flexibility to pass a high-risk, high-reward plan. Ms. Kumar, I understand you're worried about the economy, but just because we raise taxes on the payroll cap doesn't mean we lose any type of capital for any other program. If anything, because you don't give an example of a program who needs funding, we don't have that warrant to not pass this. The Social Security net is falling apart, and what's at stake is 64 million American livelihoods. I refuse to let the Americans I swore to protect fall through on the net on my watch. It's high time we show them we are the representatives they elected and pass for quick and effective change.
Thank you, Representative, for that perfectly timed speech. Seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for questioners, actually. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Kumar, oops, sorry, the lights went off in my room, and Representative Mukarehi. I'm sorry about butchering your name.
Hi, so what's the biggest percentage of our current federal government income or budget? What takes up the biggest percentage?
I would say defense budget.
So do you agree that we spend a lot of money on Social Security currently?
No, not exactly, because most of the funds come from the payroll tax cap. It's not coming from the government itself.
Okay, so as I explained in my speech, a lot of the money that we use for Social Security is taking away from funding those programs, which is what incentivizes our youth to work. So why is this in any way solving the problem if we continue to take that money away?
Okay,
Representative Mukherjee.
Hi, Representative. So Representative Faye stated in his speech that if there was a $250,000 cap, Social Security would remain solvent until 2078. So why do we need to entirely remove the cap?
We removed the cap because we still have solvency for 40 years. Remember that in another 40 years, we can place that cap back. But remember that we also have a lot of differing economic studies. But all of them, the consensus is that if you remove the cap, we have the largest period of insolvency that could happen from this bill.
But as Representative Kumar stated, there will be
Thank
a
you,
disincentive.
Representative. Now, seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for a speech in negation. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Representative Rubis, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. Hello, everyone. My name is Representative Joey Rubis. That's spelled R-U-B-A-S for the judges. So excited to be giving the second negation speech on this piece of legislation. If my judges can just tell me if you're not ready, then I'll get started. Okay, wonderful. If everyone's ready, then we'll get started. America loves stories. From Disney princesses to superhero movies, we're in love with the idea of a happily ever after. The problem is, there's not always a happy ending. So today, when America is facing a record-breaking economic crisis, it's because this legislation tells a story scarier than a horror story, that for the two reasons that this legislation hurts American small businesses and low-income Americans, I urge this chamber to vote in the negation. First, let's start with Chapter 1. Fail this bill to protect America's small businesses. To start, let's tell the story of our brutalized post-COVID-19 economy. Under the status quo, the onset of the COVID economy crisis has left businesses in ruins. The National Bureau of Economic Research tells us just this September that over 100,000 small businesses have closed since just early March, with 2/3 of the ones that are left just barely hanging on. That doesn't sound like a Cinderella story to me. But here comes the rising action. The problem with this legislation is that Section 4 says it goes into place at the beginning of 2023. By most projections, this will be right in the middle of a vital period of economic recovery from COVID-19. But by raising the payroll tax, we make this recovery harder for US businesses in two key ways. First of all, let's remember, the payroll tax is paid half by employees and half by employers. That means that by raising the payroll tax cap, you force small businesses to pay more in tax on their employees' incomes. But second, decreasing spending on small businesses by reducing their revenue. Raymond Keaton of the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council, a small business-focused research and education group, explains on December 4th of 2019 that when tax rates go up, it decreases investment in the private sector, especially with small businesses. Simply put, if you take away money from the middle to upper class, the spending they cut from their budget first is the spending on small businesses, which our economy relies on during one of the most important economic recoveries in US history. Don't let this be another dark twist in the tale of the 21st century. Fail this bill. But next, Chapter 2. Fail this bill to protect low-income Americans. Representatives Fay and Shetty, both of you tell us that this legislation helps keep low-income Americans out of poverty in the long term by protecting Social Security. I have two responses. First of all, if more businesses go underwater, that's less people who are paying the payroll tax, meaning that unfortunately, we're not raising as much revenue as you say. But second, I'm never going to trade poverty in the long term for poverty in the short term. In fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics told us just a week ago that unemployment is leaving 6 million people out of the jobs already. That's 6 million mothers and fathers unable to feed their children, students falling 6 feet under in debt, and young people forced onto the street. But when more small businesses shut down, that's also more Americans laid off. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities tells us 3 days ago that 22 million Americans don't have food to put on the table. It's easy to think of taxes as a blank check, but before the clock strikes midnight, take a second and think about who's footing the bill.
Thank you, Representative, for that perfectly timed speech. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Gandhi and Representative Saxena.
Hey, Representative. So do these small businesses usually pay their workers more than the $140,000 that the payroll tax cap is right now?
Almost all small businesses will have at least a few employees in that range.
Okay, sure. So why can't these small businesses incur these small costs if they're only paying half of the payroll tax in the first place?
These small businesses are falling into debt as the days pass. They're basically already on the verge of shutdown. Any dollar increase makes their situation worse.
Sure. So how much of an increase will this be?
It's going to vary business by business based on the type of employees, how much they pay them, all that stuff.
Yeah, sure. So if you don't know how much it's going to increase,
Saxena.
then
Thank you, Representative Saxena.
Hi, your argument is reliant on the fact that the 6% tax rate will be so detrimental that rich Americans won't have discretionary spending. Do you have any evidence that that's the actual bright line under this piece of legislation?
I'm evaluating this on a comparative, right? You're going to take away more money from high-income Americans,
Okay,
6%
so if
more,
we're
which means they have
taxing
6%
richer
less.
Americans at 6%, how does that mean they won't have discretionary spending?
I'm saying that when you take away more money, they're going to spend less. On the comparative, that means more businesses are
Thank
going
you,
to spend.
Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I am now going to call for a speech in affirmation. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placard. Representative Shaw, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Representative Chris Shaw, speaking from H.D. Jacobs High School for the first time this legislative session. As always, I'm at the leisure of those above me. Please give me a sign of indication PO when all the judges are ready for me to begin. Representatives, like Marvel's supervillain Thanos, the depletion of Social Security trust funds in the status quo is inevitable. It's an unpleasant yet inescapable reality, but while the situation seems hopeless, today we have an option to remove the cap on payroll taxes. Rather than allowing these funds to fade away, we need to snap them back to vitality. It's for the two key reasons that today's legislation reduces the negative impacts of rising wage inequality and that it offsets the consequences of rising healthcare costs. I urge for a strong vote in the affirmation today. First, let's examine how eliminating the tax cap would make Social Security more progressive, meaning it will benefit low-income individuals, unlike what Representative Rubis tells us. I turn to the Center for Economic and Policy Research in February of 2017, which says that when Congress last adjusted the cap, policymakers set the cap to cover 90% of all wages. But because wages above the cap were grown much faster than the average, earnings under the cap now make up only 82% of aggregate wages. In the past several decades, wage growth among lower and middle income Americans has slowed, while wages at the top have continued to grow, not the amount of hours worked, like Representative Kumar falsely tells us. In particular, earnings of the top 1% and especially the top 0.1% have grown rapidly, resulting in an increasing share of earnings above Social Security's tax cap. When we eliminate the cap, we reduce this trailing effect. Contrary to the assertions made by Representative Kumar and Representative Rubis, that this bill dissuades working Americans and that it hurts low-income individuals, these funds come only at the expense of the wealthiest Americans who are in this position due to their wage, not the amount they work, meaning that this bill will have very little impact on what we truly consider the working class. Right now, Social Security's taxable payroll lags behind compensation, but if we raise the base for how much income can be taxed, we can keep pace with earnings growth, and we might even reduce wealth disparities, so we must affirm. Now next, let's analyze how rising healthcare costs have also hurt Social Security's finances, something today's legislation directly compensates for. I turn to the Social Security's Administration's Office of Retirement and Disability Policy in November of 2017, which says that excluding employer-sponsored health insurance premiums from Social Security payroll taxes cost about $100 billion in foregone payroll taxes in 2015 and will cost about $1.25 trillion over 10 years. Currently, premiums for employer-sponsored health insurance are exempt from Social Security taxes. As healthcare costs have risen over the past 30 years, wages have fallen as a share of employees' compensation. Both Representative Kumar and Representative Rubis expressed concern that raising taxes would take from vulnerable groups that need social safety programs, but passing today's legislation has no impact on this group of constituents beyond greater returns. The rising share of employee compensation is going to take health insurance necessitates a restructuring of the program, so we must affirm. Representatives, it's for the past two reasons that leads to a reduction in the lag of payroll taxes and allows for compensation to the system. I urge you to vote in affirmation. With time running out, we're in the end game. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, for that 2-minute and 59-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Rubis and Representative Halfman.
Do small businesses get most of their revenue from wealthy or low-income Americans?
I don't have an answer. It depends on the location of the small business. I think small businesses grow from low-income individuals.
I mean, wealthy individuals have more money to spend, right? So it's more likely them than low-income individuals. So if we're taxing these high-income individuals, isn't that going to take our already incredibly vulnerable small businesses and put them in a worse situation?
Small business owners tend to be on the low income who won't be affected by today's legislation, who are under
Representative Halfman.
Today's legislation aims to compensate for a lack of fiscal solvency in Social Security. What originally caused that lack of solvency?
Like I said, when the wages of high income earners exceeded the rate at which the payroll tax was growing, set by the previous policymakers in approximately 1970, that caused this shift in balance.
Right. Was that the main cause of the lack of solvency?
Yes, the rising wages of
Thank you,
high-income
representatives.
earners. Thank you.
Because that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for a speech in negation. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Representative Halfman, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. This is Representative Halfman speaking for the first time this session in the negation. As always, I'm at the leisure of all those above me, so any indication when you're ready. Virtual backgrounds have increasingly replaced weekend cleaning. And while they're really effective at covering piles of laundry or an unmade bed, that's exactly what they do. They cover a problem instead of fixing it, just like today's legislation. So it's for the two key reasons that one, we need to rectify administrative failures in Social Security first, and two, that the Office of the Inspector General or the OIG can effectively implement reforms, we fail. But first, we're negating today's legislation because we need to rectify administrative failures first. Now, when I just asked Representative Shaw in questioning what the reason for the lack of Social Security solvency is, he claims it's the increasing healthcare costs and our inability to capitalize on that tax revenue. But that is not the case. It is not the lack of taxpayer revenue, but rather our abuse of it that has led to the Social Security crisis that is the focus of today's debate. So according to the Social Security Agency in 2018, the SSA recovered $4 billion in overpayments at a cost of $280 million. Now, $4 billion in recovery may seem significant, but that's compared to the $23.9 billion in overpayments that they weren't able to recover. Now, Representative Shetty, you claim that it's necessary that we make some sacrifices to ensure the long-term solvency of Social Security. But I argue that we are not justified in using more taxpayer dollars until we stop abusing them. We may need to increase the payroll tax cap in the future, but until we have tried fixing the holes with our use of taxpayer dollars, we cannot justify increasing the amount we collect. So because we need to rectify these administrative failures first, we fail today's legislation. But this is not just in theory that we would fix these major flaws in Social Security. We have neglected the actual way to accomplish that, which brings me to my second point, that the OIG can implement effective reforms. Now, Representative Fay was concerned about elderly women and people of color being disproportionately affected by Social Security's lack of solvency. But understand, we can help those groups and guarantee that solvency through other viable solutions. According to the fiscal year 2020 congressional justification, the Office of the Inspector General had the goal of a return of $8 for every $1 invested into their Social Security reforms. Instead, they yielded a return on investment of 32 to 1. But despite that, we have never sufficiently funded the Office of the Inspector General and given them the money they need to increase their efforts in the Social Security Administration reforms. So we have the tools at our disposal to fix the flaws in Social Security without burdening the taxpayers. But instead, we have neglected those solutions in favor of legislation like Bill 101, which places the burden on taxpayers instead of the incompetencies of the federal government's oversights. So ultimately, we need to stop using taxpayer dollars as a green screen for the problems.
Thank you, Representative, for that 3-minute speech. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative I'm sorry. Just trying to make sure everyone gets a chance. Representative Fay and Representative Saxena.
Okay, hi, Representative. If your issue with today's legislation is that there's not enough reform in the current U.S. Social Security Administration, in Section 4 it specifically states that the bill goes into effect in January 1st of 2022. Doesn't that give us adequate time to implement the reforms that you're talking about?
I don't think 30 years of insolvency can be solved with 1 year of solutions. If we actually want to dedicate time towards solving the problems in the Social Security Administration that have been perpetuating over several decades, we need to give time to have viable solutions. So having 2 years isn't enough time to justify burdening.
Representative Saxena.
Why do overpayments happen?
Overpayments happen because of a lack of proper administration. We haven't funded the Social Security Administration properly, and as a result of not having that oversight, that's what leads to overpayments.
Properly, doesn't this bill fix that funding gap?
Right. Well, the funding gap originated from not dealing with these overpayments. If we fund the Inspector General instead, we translate that funding without burdening taxpayers.
The problem is Social Security isn't funded enough, and that leads to oversight.
Thank you, Representatives. Seeing as that was a speech and negation, I now call for a speech and affirmation. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. Representative, can you tell me how to pronounce it? Mukherjee?
Mukherjee.
Mukherjee. Mukherjee, you have the floor, Representative. I apologize.
I think the chair, that's totally fine. This is Representative Mukherjee. That's Muk like book, like her, and G like tea. And I'm speaking for the first time in today's legislative session. And as always, I'm at the leisure of my PO and judges. PO, I just have one small request for you. If you could give me a final thumbs up when all of the judges are ready, that would be perfect. Great, thank you. According to Business Insider, in 2021, billionaires have made over $3.9 trillion during the pandemic. Billionaires just keep getting richer, and the lower income people are facing evictions and waiting for stimulus checks by their mailboxes. There is rising income and wealth inequality in this country, and that is due to the Social Security gap. The higher income just keep getting more money, while the lower income have to face the burden of this cost. But today, Representatives, we finally changed that income inequality by passing today's piece of legislation and not capping payroll taxes at all. So let's look at why today's legislation is so important, and that's because the current tax is regressive and that we actually increase economic opportunities for low-income constituents. So Representative Shetty and Representative Shaw I've already talked about why today's piece of why the current payroll tax cap is regressive, but let me talk about why it is so detrimental to Americans. Now, according to Newsweek in July of 2019, 80% of Americans said that the payroll tax was the biggest tax they had to incur, even more than the income tax. And according to MarketWatch in 2018, 4 out of 10 Americans can't even cover a $400 emergency expense. So when Representative Rubis is talking about how 22 million people in the status quo don't have enough money to put food on the table, he needs to understand that it's because of this current payroll tax cap that the richer just keep getting richer and the lower income have to face these costs. When we pass today's legislation, we help every single person who relies on Social Security and make sure that they don't go into poverty at all. Now let's talk about Representative Halfman's issue with the administrative issues. She just said in questioning that we need to dedicate time to focus on these issues. But let's go back to Representative Faye's statistic. He talked about how the Disability Insurance Fund is going to be depleted by 2026. That is 5 years, Representatives. We do not have time for that at all, and we need to pass today's piece of legislation to promote equity in this country, to make sure that the rich are paying their fair share, and we do that by implementing this proportional tax, taxing everyone at 6.2%. But now let's look at why today's piece of legislation is so great, and that's because it helps increase educational opportunities. Now, according to Equitable Growth in September of 2014, there is a socioeconomic achievement gap that is increasing, which means that affluent parents have more money, which means they can invest more into educational opportunities for their children, while lower income and middle income families cannot do that at all. So when Representative Kumar is talking about economic growth in this country, she needs to understand is that when we decrease the achievement gap in this country by making sure the rich pay their fair share, we actually increase the economic growth for our country to make sure that there are more educational opportunities for lower income constituents because we decrease this gap. We always need to make sure that we are helping the most vulnerable Americans, and we do that by passing today's piece of legislation.
Thank you, Representative Mukherjee, for that 2-minute and 58-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Rubis and Representative Halfman.
Does this bill decrease taxes on anyone?
No, it increases taxes, but it
Right,
increases
exactly
access to
the point.
opportunities.
So for the low-income Americans who are strangled by this tax, does this bill do literally anything to help them?
Yes, it does. In the future, these low-income Americans will now have Social Security benefits that they can depend on. But when Social Security is depleted, they won't have these benefits at all.
Why is the way to protect Social Security by getting rid of jobs in the short term?
We're not getting rid of jobs in the short term.
That's my entire speech. You burden small businesses in a time where they can't.
Right, but you didn't
Representative
prove
Halfman.
Established that 2 years wasn't enough time. What about 5 years do you think an entire administration prevents us from having any reforms that are effective?
I'm not exactly sure I understand your question, but you need to understand the severity.
5 years isn't enough time. What
No,
tells
it's
not enough time?
It's not, because the entire insurance fund will be completely depleted. Our most vulnerable Americans will not be getting the benefits that they were promised.
And why can't we address overpayments in 5 years?
We can't address overpayments in 5 years because every day we don't pass a piece of legislation like this, the more that the trust fund becomes depleted.
That was a speech and affirmation. I'm now going to call for a speech and negation. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Representative Wu, you have the floor.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Representative Zach Wu, spelled W-U. First time today. I'm on the negative. If my judges need anything from me, let me know. But if not, thumbs up and I'll be happy to begin. Excellent, excellent. And PO good? Okay. When President Franklin Roosevelt spearheaded Social Security as a part of his New Deal recovery plan 100 years ago, his original assessment did not even include the rich. They weren't supposed to pay into the system, and they weren't supposed to reap its benefits. But after months of deliberations with the legislative branch, he was forced to compromise. But yet still, Roosevelt consistently emphasized that high-income earners should not be the focus of Social Security programs. Social Security is an insurance program designed to guarantee security for only those who need it. Like I asked our sponsor, Representative Fay, in examination, the reason the cap currently exists is because there is a current cap on the benefits received at full retirement age. That is a double bind for the entire affirmative, but especially for those who try to champion higher taxes on the rich. Either A, today's bill disproportionately benefits high earners by increasing their benefits and the share of federal revenue they receive through benefits, an outcome directly perpendicular to the objective of the program, or B, if those Americans pay more into the system, they don't get more out of it. You are always failing a standard of fairness if you vote affirmative. Remember this when we previous question, but independently, lifting the cap on payroll taxes unnecessarily creates one of the largest tax hikes in American history. Sean Williams of the NASDAQ exchange explains in March of 2019 that removing the cap would conservatively add $1.5 trillion in tax income over the next decade. But the theory of the negative case here isn't that taxation is bad, but it's that taxation must be strategic. Expending every single iota of political capital to justify the biggest change to American tax policy in the past 100 years today is a surefire way to ensure that this legislative body no longer has any capability to reform tax policy or change the tax code in the future. I don't think increasing the provision of money to Social Security necessarily takes any money out of any other programs, like Representative Kumar argues. But worse, I think it paralyzes all effective congressional tax policy down the line. Representative Shetty, You can't change taxes willy-nilly in a country whose literal founding was an act of protest against unfair taxation. The Pew Research Center explains in January of 2018 that it already takes Congress multiple years to push through tax reform or tax policy changes, even minute ones. In the past 4 decades, since the current budgetary system has been in effect, Congress has only passed appropriations measures 4 times. The jockeying, log rolling, and compromising that Congress needs to pass any given tax bill is massive. We have to sufficiently justify to our people that our tax policy doesn't hurt their wallets. But realize, if we have any suspicion that this bill isn't the correct solution, we completely disable our ability to fix it in the future. I hate to be a cynic, but when this bill guarantees that this Congress no longer votes for its conscience or its constituents,
Thank you, Representative Wu, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Shaw and Representative Shetty.
Representative, while today's legislation creates a tax hike in terms of amount of revenue earned, does it really impact a vast majority of Americans?
Whether or not it impacts 1 American or 1 million Americans, trying to justify this tax policy change with political capital disables our ability to reform tax policy in the future.
Why is that? Shouldn't we turn to our highest income
Because
Americans
Congress
if we're
takes
running
multiple
out
years.
of Social Security trust funds?
Congress takes multiple years to pass appropriations, tax, and spending bills in the status quo
Representative
because we have to
Shetty.
sufficiently convince our constituents.
Representative Shetty.
So one of the reasons why we have trouble passing policy is because we're afraid of risk. But if we pass this bill and make sure we have more flexibility, doesn't that mean in the future we can have more risk in the solutions we can pass?
No, in the future, we no longer will have enough popular support from our constituents or any of our people to justify any tax policy changes if we try to wrestle this legislation through, expending the most political capital we ever had in the past 100 years.
Sure, but if Americans are the ones that are going to be
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. Representative Saxena, you have the floor.
Thank the chair. For all of my judges, is there anyone who's not ready? Okay, cool. I'm just pulling up a timer then to time myself. Social Security numbers aren't recycled. That means that there will never be another American who has a Social Security number that's the exact same as mine. But while Social Security numbers aren't recycled, the negation's arguments surrounding Social Security are starting to recycle and repeat. Let's sift through the debris and understand why you pass. I'd like to argue that the majority of the negation's impacts have been overstated because they don't realize the limited scope of today's legislation. Representative Rubas tells us that low-income Americans are going to be strangled by the tax because raising the payroll tax means that small businesses will have a harder time surviving because increased taxes means reduced discretionary spending. That's not true. As the Congressional Research Service explains in September 2020, in 2017, about 6% of workers earned more than the taxable earnings base. Representative Rubas, what that means is that this piece of legislation only impacts 6% of Americans. And when payroll tax rates remain stagnant at 6.2%, the impacts of not enough discretionary spending to keep up small businesses are just entirely incorrect, and your impacts overblown, because it all relies on the assumption that eliminating the cap means that rich Americans won't have the same levels of discretionary spending. But next, Representative Kumar tells us that people will stop working in order to avoid the lack of a payroll tax cap. CRS again explains why that's incorrect, because 95% of individuals above the base were wage and salary workers. Representative Kumar, what that means is that they can't decide to just cut back on their hours because they don't dictate them. The only way for workers to cut on their hours becomes quitting their jobs, and that's not going to happen because if they had enough saved up for retirement, they would have already stopped working. But finally, Representative Wu is worried about how high-income Americans would then be getting more out of the program than they'll be putting into it. But yet again, CRS again explains why this is incorrect. Because for the 6% of Americans who now won't be subject to this cap, median percentage increases in benefits the median percentage increase in benefits will only be 4% for affected beneficiaries, and that's only going to happen in 2030. Representative Wu, these higher benefit payments payments would lead to, as the report continues, these higher benefit payments would lead to greater program outlays, although these expenditures would be more than offset by greater tax revenues, meaning that even if rich Americans are getting less out of the program, we're still making sure that Social Security can survive. But finally, as the AARP Public Policy Institute explains in 2020, that just by eliminating a payroll tax cap, this change by itself would wipe out virtually 86% of Social Security's financing gap over the next 75 years. Representative Halfman, I can understand that you don't want to fund Social Security until we stop the abuses, but unless we do so, the Americans we made a promise to won't be getting their promised funds.
Thank you, Representative Saxena, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Bopana and Representative Wu.
Hello. So when we inadvertently increase the amount of Social Security we have allocated within our budget, doesn't that also increase the amount of demand that consumers would take with that Social Security?
Social Security doesn't work like that. Like, I can't say, oh, I want more Social Security. It's directly how much
No, I'm not saying that. When you expand Social Security, you increase the availability to new consumers, correct?
No, because you need to be 65 to draw out of Social Security unless you want to retire early.
That doesn't matter because every single person that is unemployed has a chance.
Representative Wu.
Thank you. So I just want to clarify, does this legislation expand or decrease benefits for the high income earners that are paying this tax?
I'm saying in either world, it's still a net benefit. If it decreases benefits, well, rich Americans, like, they still have enough money saved up in like their own retirement savings.
Right, but
that's why they've never relied on Social
how does this not violate a basic principle of fairness? Like, if rich Americans are paying a greater proportion.
tax rate is progressive. We're just now finally applying that principle to Social Security as well.
Okay, cool. If they decrease their benefits and they're paying
Thank you,
far more into the
Representative.
system.
Seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for a speech in negation. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Representative Jordan, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. That's Representative Jordan speaking for the first time this legislative session. I'm at the leisure of all those above me, of course, so any indication that all of you are ready would be great. Okay, I believe that's everyone. Taylor Swift once said in her hit song, Blank Space, "'Cause darling, I'm a nightmare, just like a daydream." Now, of course, Social Security is not exactly in the same realm as failed romantic relationships. This bill really is just a nightmare and shouldn't be passed. Although I agree with the intentions of this bill to help lower income Americans and the payroll tax gap, we must negate this bill to protect the poor and middle class, and because it simply does not have enough solvency. First, I'd like to address something that hasn't really been addressed in this debate yet about this bill's solvency. This bill inherently will not have enough solvency because the revenue from this bill is non-substantial at best. This is true because according to a report by Rachel Bresler, former senior economist on the staff of the Joint Economic Committee, for every dollar of new revenue credited to Social Security as a result by raising the payroll tax cap, 48 cents in combined federal and state taxes would be lost, resulting in a net revenue gain of only 52 cents. And raising the tax in general will actually harm Social Security in the long run. By removing the payroll tax cap, the government is taking a massive amount of money from businesses and individuals who now cannot spend that money throughout the economy, meaning that they cannot create jobs, known as more people who can pay into Social Security. So what the affirmation wants to do at best is take people's money to barely solve a problem, and at worst, take people's money to make a problem worse. Don't allow it and reject this bill. But I'd also like to tell you why we must negate this bill to protect the poor. Because as Representative Wu and other countless representatives have brought it up, Social Security will be forced to pay more than it gets in. According to the Washington Post in May of 2019, the more you pay in Social Security tax, the bigger the benefit you get, but the lower your benefit is compared to the Social Security tax you paid. So in theory, if you are currently earning over $1 million a year, Social Security will have to pay you at least $160,000 per year. So we aren't going to see an increase in revenue for the people impacted by the payroll tax cap and Social Security. Helping the people, we are not going to see people helped, the representatives Faye, Shetty, and Shaw, and others claim to help because the payouts and even some of the money poor people pay are just going to go to pay for rich people. Next, we must negate to protect middle-class Americans because raising the payroll tax cap prevents job growth, something that is imperative in the recovery of COVID-19, as Representative Rubas has stated. According to the Heritage Foundation, 5 years after the elimination of the payroll tax cap, there will be a 219,000 less jobs than there would be. This is because when we raise the tax, it means that less money is going to be spent by the consumer because it's taken by the government, meaning that there's less money circulating throughout the economy. So basically what I'm trying to say is when we pass this bill, we remove the ability for private citizens to spend, thus hurting the economic growth of the country, as jobs won't be able to grow and people will not be able to live the American dream. So I urge you to negate this bill and do not let this daydream dressed as a nightmare pass.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Representative, for that 2-minute and 45-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Shetty and Representative Mukherjee.
What happens when retirees don't have enough funds from Social Security to spend it on the economy later in the decade?
I mean, yes, I do agree that Social Security is failing right now and retirees do not have enough money. But what I'm trying to say is that retirees will not have enough money at all in the future with this bill either. I'm just saying that it does not have enough solvency because the net revenue from Social Security won't be enough for retirees or future generations.
Sure. So since we're not changing the benefit structure, why wouldn't low-income earners not get the same benefits?
Because as I said, they wouldn't be able to get the same benefits because Social Security would be forced to pay more than it gets.
Representative Mukherjee.
Hi, Representative. So you said that by passing this bill, we remove the private ability for high-income earners to spend, but haven't we done that to low-income constituents as well?
Sure, yes, we have done that to low-income constituents as well. I'm just
So
trying.
where's the equity?
Yes, there might not be any equity, but I'm just trying to highlight the fact that private and normal low-income consumers wouldn't be able to spend and help fuel the economy.
Sure, but aren't we making this tax proportional now?
Not necessarily proportional because, as I said, the payouts cancel at any kind of payroll tax gap that you're.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation. Representative Ramachandra, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Representative Ramachandra speaking for the first time in this legislative session. As always, I'm at the leisure of those above me. So PO and judges, please give me any sign of indication when you are ready. All right, PO, judges, how are we doing? Good. All right. As Americans, it's an expectation that we pay it forward. We leave this country in a better state than we found it, such that our next generation of Americans is able to prosper. But when it comes to Social Security and funding our next generation, we have fundamentally failed in our purpose as Congresspeople if we don't account for the futures of our Americans. But this bill provides an opportunity to fix that. Affirm this bill because it, 1, provides economic assistance for low-income families, and 2, mitigates the impact of welfare cliffs. So first, affirm this bill because it provides economic assistance for low-income families. That's because when you remove the payroll tax cap and allow greater allocations to welfare, it actually solves some of the budgetary issues that we see with states. According to the Social Security Administration, Social Security includes public assistance and welfare, such as temporary assistance for needy families and family/child welfare services. So we see that Social Security is currently being used to fund these services, but let's look at what states have actually done with their money. Because according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, in January 2021, states use half of these federal temporary assistance for needy family funds on earned income tax credits, and they have to divert funds away from this TANF program because there is physically not enough money. They spend less than 1/2 of this fund on basic cash assistance and 1/3 on work promotion. So we see that currently this deficiency of funds is the reason that states aren't actually able to account for these programs. But let's look at how this bill actually provides solvency and quantify the impact. According to Tax Foundation in August 2016, removing the payroll tax cap generates $1.8 trillion over 10 years. So when Section 1 of this bill specifically removes this payroll tax cap, we see that $1.8 trillion is going to be able to reinvest it into the Social Security programs, such that needy families that rely on this economic assistance can actually get this money. So when Representative Kumar says this bill is a disincentive to work, there is no reason that people are disincentivized to work during an economic crisis where they need to provide for their families. And Representative Halfman uses administrative burdens as a reason to justify negating this bill. But because of the immediacy of this issue, we need to affirm and provide some compensation. Affirm this bill. But next, affirm this bill because it mitigates the impacts of welfare cliffs. That's because when you increase compensation for these welfare programs, it actually takes away from the financial loss that we see with welfare in the first place. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures in August 2019, when low-income people earn more, their benefits phase out and low-income people end up losing money. Let's quantify this. According to Learn Liberty in August 2016, going from $12 to $15 an hour decreases total income by $3,000. So we see that there's a welfare cliff, but this bill solves that because when Section 1 of this bill removes a payroll tax cap, we see greater allocations that we can put towards these programs such that welfare cliffs have less of an impact. So when Representative Kumar and Jordan say that this bill takes funding away from tax revenue towards other programs, income isn't being spent there in the first place anyway, so we might as well allocate it to families that need this money. When Representative Ruba says that this bill hurts
Thank you, Representative Ramachandra, for that 3-minute speech. That as seen as that was a speech in affirmation, I'm now going to call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Kumar and Representative Shaw.
Hi, so who's been most impacted by the pandemic? Low-income families or high-income families?
Low-income families.
So who's being impacted the most under this legislation? High-income families, correct?
Yeah, I would say so.
So isn't that an incentive for them to work less because they're not impacted as much as low-income workers?
So you're basically just saying people give up if they get taxed. That's simply not going to happen considering they're already high-income earners. But what you see with this bill is you reallocate funding to low-income families that actually need it.
So why is getting taxed not an incentive to avoid the taxing in the first place?
Because you're assuming that people just give up. But
Representative Shaw.
Representative, why do you claim welfare cliffs are no longer a concern when low-income individuals are going to be reaping the same amount of benefits when they retire?
No, I'm not saying that it's not going to be a concern. I'm just saying, given that we have more money to allocate towards them, although welfare cliffs will still be a problem, we can allocate more funding in order to mitigate this issue.
How are we going to mitigate that with additional funding? Isn't that a structural
issue? You have
issue?
more funding to actually compensate for that.
I rescind the rest of my time.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for a speech in negation. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Representative Bopana, you have the floor.
Thank you. This is Representative Bopana speaking for the first time this session. Any indication from my PO and judges, and I'll begin. Cool. Thank you. The one day that every average middle-aged American dreads every year is April 15th, otherwise known as Tax Day. But it's not the monotonous filing that occurs on that day. It's the fact that gradually over time, the United States welfare system has increasingly taken out money from our constituents, entrenching them in a never-ending parasitic relationship with Social Security. Principally, fail this legislation because it increases dependence on social programs, which inadvertently slows economic growth and harms our lowest and poorest constituents. The theory of the affirmative position is that expansion of Social Security inherently gives more benefits to our poorest Americans. But ultimately, that brief influx of funding almost instantaneously is compensated by an increase in Social Security dependency. In fact, in the status quo, the dependency ratio on Social Security is steadily increasing over time as the elderly expect Social Security benefits to power them through their retirement or the golden years of life. In fact, USA Today on May 2019 states that 44% of older Americans who are retired to or plan to retire within 10 years see Social Security as their main source of retirement income. And according to that February survey of 1,315 adults aged 50 or older, a unit of the nationwide financial 26% believe they can live comfortably on Social Security alone. But understand that when you pass this legislation, you flip that script. And those people, obviously compensated by benefits in the status quo, have to have an increased amount of dependency because we expand the Social Security right now. In fact, Monique Morrissey of the Economic Policy Institute in 2019 states that increasing payroll taxes and expanding benefits reduces after-tax pay, and the need for private savings shrinks the labor supply while increasing aggregate demand. Two things that don't conversely go together, meaning that Representative Ramachandra, the low-income families you advocate for can get net benefits in the status quo, but ultimately, A, they concede their current wages for funding in the future, and B, strain their income through the tax hikes that Representative Wu alluded to. But ultimately, it ensures that our lowest level Americans stay trapped in a tax cycle, taking more than giving back. In fact, the foundation of economic education states that in a sense of proportionality, if someone gets 20% in Social Security benefits, their tax burdens on net range from 33% to 41%. Often in public policy, we think about what money we collect and what we could do with it, instead of thinking about our constituents' pockets and wondering what they could have done with it. Fail this legislation.
Thank you, Representative, for that 2 minute and 51-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Ramachandra and Representative Reddy.
So how exactly is paying into a system that redistributes income to low-income people going to be a net harm for them?
One, tax hikes, because when you redistribute that, you get that money from higher income individuals. Second, because people who are already dependent on Social Security right now have to pay more taxes.
Yeah, you're talking about dependency, but during a pandemic where low-income families are suffering, is that really your first concern, or do you want to give immediate cash assistance?
I would never actually take away long-term benefits for short-term solvency.
Representative Reddy.
Okay, considering the most low-income Americans can't afford traditional retirement plans, isn't it a good thing that the government provides for them when they're old by making sure that part of their wages are provided for?
Absolutely, but you take that away by instigating increased tax hikes and allowing them to fall into the parasitic relationship that Social
But those tax hikes fall on the rich, so the poor don't face that burden.
Tax hikes fall on everyone.
No, because it's the payroll tax cap, which is $142,000, which is
Thank you,
not most poor
Representative.
Americans.
Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placard. Representative Chen, you stand unopposed.
I thank the chair.
You raise your placard unopposed, I should say.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Representative Chen speaking for the first time this session. As always, can I get an indication when everyone's ready? Good, great, stupendous, awesome, great. I assume no one's ready, or no one's not ready? Awesome. In the second negation speech of today's round, Representative Rubis took us through the story of Social Security. He started at Chapter 1. His advocacy threatens to take us to Chapter 9. Under today's legislation, we boil down this debate into two key issues, the payroll tax and solvency. See why the affirmative wins both. First, on the payroll tax, the central negation advocacy in today's round, championed by Representative Rubis and Kumar and further extended by Representative Jordan, is that payroll tax increases hurt the economy by decreasing employment and hurting businesses. And they're exactly right. Payroll tax increases are horrible for the economy. But you pass today's legislation to minimize the impact of payroll tax increases. Because if we fail today's legislation now, we're going to have to increase payroll taxes by more in the future, because the Social Security insolvency only grows. The Congressional Research Service explains in September of 2020 that if we don't take action now and put off solving Social Security until 2044, where the trust fund runs out, we have to raise payroll taxes by 3.14% to compensate for the shortfall. Today's debate isn't a question between increasing payroll taxes and not increasing payroll taxes. It's a question between increasing payroll taxes by a little bit now or increasing it by a lot in the future. Fundamentally, Mr. Rubis and Ms. Kumar both tell us that payroll taxes are bad for the economy. Increase them by less by affirming. But Representative Wu argues that tax increases delegitimize our future policy to be able to reform the tax system. But here's the issue. If we inevitably increase taxes by a lot in the future, we only delegitimize ourselves further. Fight for a more human future and affirm. Bring solvency back. But second, let's look at the solvency of this legislation, because Representative Wu and Representative Jordan both assert that today's legislation would increase benefits for high-income people. Here's the issue. They actually get less, they pay in more than they get out. The Congressional Research Service explains in September of 2020 that for every $5 that a high-income individual pays in, they only get $1 in benefits. That's because Social Security benefits are progressively calculated, meaning that at a certain point, you get less for every dollar you put in. You solve in the long term. Representative Fay already told you that passing today's legislation increases the solvency horizon for Social Security to 2070. We make the change that we need. But Representative Halfman argues that we should fix bureaucratic issues first. And bureaucratic issues should be something that we fix. But fixing bureaucratic issues alone isn't enough to close the funding gap. The Social Security Administration quantifies in 2020 that the current funding gap is $264 billion a year, 10 times what you would get from solving administrative issues. On both funding and solvency, we must pass today's legislation. Do the right thing. Affirm.
Thank you, Representative, for that 2-minute and 54-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Wu and Representative Rubis.
Thank you. So let's talk about, policy down the line. So let's say in a year from now, you want to pass an appropriations bill that increases taxes to pay for something like education or public works.
Yes.
What is your plan to justify a further tax hike on your constituents after you've just signed into law the biggest tax hike in the past 100 years?
Well, I'll talk to you guys. All of us are representatives. We all seem reasonable. If we get enough people to vote on it, we could pass it, regardless of past policy.
Right. So you're going to pass this policy, future tax hikes, in the face of opposition from your constituents.
Not opposition from our constituents.
Representative Rubis.
Really?
So I tell you that our economy is uniquely vulnerable because of the pandemic. Why isn't it worth it to just wait 2 or 3 years before we pass this bill?
Right. So this legislation goes into effect fiscal year 2024. So we're already waiting.
Okay, it's fiscal year 2023, but isn't pushing it back just a few more years than when we're still recovering in 2023 going to be a good thing?
Right. I would contend that the massive economic shock caused by the immediate raise in payroll taxes is more detrimental because we don't know if we're going to be in a recession like 15 years down the line.
But why would we want to make the current recession worse?
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech and affirmation, I now call for a speech and negation. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Representative Reddy, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. This is Laya Reddy speaking for the first time this legislative session and is likely the last negation speaker. As always, I'm at the leisure of all those above me, so please give me any indication when you're ready. PO, judge. Awesome. Sorry, just really briefly. Representatives, I'm not an avid botanist, but even I know that when a plant is sick, you must pull it out by its roots before it infects the rest of the garden. Social Security is being plagued by parasitic problems. It's because this bill fails to address the root causes that we must negate. First, let's understand that the concept of Social Security is insolvent because it's always playing catch up. To quantify, ABC News explains in April 2019, the cost of the program has struggled to keep pace with the cost of paying out benefits for some 174 million Americans. So the current way that we have benefits coming out is not really affordable. But the affirmation believes that when we pass this piece of legislation, we can prolong it. Ms. Shetty gives us the number of 2078. So that's supposed to be a long-term benefit. However, according to the New York Times in June of 2019, even if Social Security payroll caps are removed, the benefit checks for retirees would be cut about 20% across the board in 15 years. So Mr. Ramachandran, when you don't have the same level of benefit checks for those most helped by Social Security, I don't really see your welfare cliff impact ever materializing. And Mr. Chen, payroll tax hikes are not the problem, but the problem is that even when you create this change, you're not going to get benefits to be sustainable as they should be. But then Mr. Shaw argues that this is a more progressive system, that this is better for Americans overall. But the issue is that the cost falls on the middle class. And this is because Section 1 ends all payroll cap. So essentially, earnings are going to be above 140,000. Those are the ones being taxed. And that's not the rich, that's the middle class. According to the US Census Bureau in January of 2017, eliminating the Social Security taxable wage cap would subject 6.9 million families to over $400 billion in tax increases. Here's where we solve for scope, Ms. Saxena, on the negation side. So, Ms. Mukherjee, we're not really equalizing the rich and the poor. It's just another case of Capitol Hill taking the green out of middle class wallets. But we're also going to be seeing benefits deplete faster. Since the middle class is taking most of the burden, you're going to see them retiring early at 62 over 65 because they want to avoid paying payroll taxes. We are incentivizing that situation. But then, we understand we are also furthering the seeds of discord because we're having new savings trends that makes the idea of Social Security actually hurt the middle class. And the middle class essentially accounts for 66% of Americans, who you should be concerned about. Because not only is Social Security not solvent, the tax cap, eliminating it, also forces people to put money into a payroll tax that simply won't get back. According to the Federal Reserve in November of 2020, household personal savings have rocketed 35% due to the recession since people are spending less. And this is not short term because according to USA Today, this is lasting effects over the next 70 years. So essentially, the purpose of Social Security was because Americans weren't saving enough for retirement plans. Retirement plans like 401ks are much better and don't have the solvency problems that I just illuminated.
Thank you, Representative Reddy, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Chen and Representative Shetty.
What percent of the US population is 6.9 million people?
I think it's a substantial amount of people because the middle class is probably 66% of America.
Right, but like 6.9 million, that's the top 6% of America, right?
Mm-hmm. I think what I'm trying to say is that compared to the richest of the rich, most of the burden will be for people who aren't millionaires, but still are affected by this tax cap.
How is the top 6% the middle class?
It would be the middle class because the middle class ranges from the poverty line all the way to millionaires. So I think that's such a broad scope.
Even if there's a slight harm on the top 6%, isn't Social Security designed for low-income, more vulnerable constituents?
I think the issue that I'm having is that the current system, no matter whether you have payroll tax caps or you get rid of them, is that it always falls in the middle class instead of increasing maybe the tax purely on like the rich. I don't think the 12% number should be uniform considering, the inequity.
So why can't we take the 40 or more years as a buffer and spend time on re-education programs teaching low-income?
Because you still don't keep benefits at the rate that they should be.
Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation. Is there any such speeches? Representative Vade, you raise your placard unopposed.
Oh, this is Representative Vade speaking for the first time this session. I'm just going to be timing myself and I'll start shortly. If anyone isn't ready, just give me a verbal indication. Otherwise, I'll begin. My grandmother lives in a small house in the middle of a retirement community. Every time we leave her small apartment on the drive home, I think about the small things she finds pleasure in, from a golf ball she found to cooking food for me. I want to make sure that grandparents all around America can also enjoy the break they have earned. Today's debate boils down to two main questions. First, the effect of this legislation on solving the issues of Social Security, and second, the broader impact of increased payroll tax on the economy as a whole. First, let's look at the effects of this legislation on Social Security as a whole. Representative Faye and Shetty set the tone for the affirmation as they proved that this legislation would increase the viability of Social Security as a whole. The fact is that when you increase the funding going into Social Security, you increase the viability of the program itself. The best arguments of the affirmative have been concerned with the fact that this isn't a complete solution. That's far from the point, however. The longer we wait, the worse the problem is going to become. On top of that, passing today's legislation at the very least guarantees that we increase the time period we're able to pay for the people's retirement. When millions of Americans who've literally built this country on their backs are seeing their futures being erased by empty words, That's when you know we have to pass. But next, I want to look at the arguments in today's debate concerned with the economic impacts of Social Security. The bottom line set by speakers on the negation is that benefits from Social Security most outweigh the costs it has on the economy. Representative Kumar came up here and told you at the start of the debate and contend that it would reduce spending in the highest income bracket of people. The economic impacts of today's legislation, however, made the foundation of the negation's argument. While Representative Chen painted a comparative analysis of tax hikes now versus in the future, I'm going to explain why the affirmative wins built on this fact, meaning that passing now increased the benefits of Social Security in the long term. According to the Washington Post, the rich spend a smaller proportion of their income than the poor in general on necessary goods. The money they do spend is largely on extravagant spending, like pleasures in expensive restaurants and theaters. This was before the COVID-19 pandemic, which by and large decreased the amount the rich spend in total. Rich people have a lower overall expenditure on living in proportion to their income. When we pass, we take this money that they aren't using and putting it into a segment of the population that is guaranteed to use the money. According to Market Watch, people in retirement spend a larger percentage of their income, especially when it increases. And by and large, they spend their income on necessary goods like food, personal insurance, and cash contributions. When you remove money from the top percentage of people, it doesn't just go away. It goes into the very industries that poor Americans are so uniquely dependent on. The Washington Post in 2015 goes on to further that poor Americans spend the highest proportion of their income on things like food, transportation, healthcare, and these costs are rising for them. Increasing the spending of those in retirement directly invests in the industries that poor Americans are uniquely dependent on. Representatives, this legislation is not only necessary for the future of Americans, but it's necessary for those who put their lives on the line and died for America. This is for those.
Thank you, Representative Vade, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Opana and Representative Kumar.
Well, I still don't understand the establishment of links here. You're saying that Social Security goes toward industries. How does that make?
Right. So the thing is, when we increase Social Security, like going into these retirement people's funds, what it eventually does is it makes it so that they spend more. They spend a higher proportion of their income on things that people actually
benefits, right? They're not liquid cash that you can just use at the supermarket. They're like specific things that you have in the back burner.
Right. But right now, the rich aren't spending this money on necessary goods, and they aren't.
Representative Kumar.
So if they aren't spending it on necessary goods, why aren't they spending it on small businesses like Representative Rubis already told us?
Right. So the problem is that right now they're spending it on things that are extravagant. They spend on things like theater and expensive restaurants.
But doesn't that help small businesses as well?
Right. That doesn't help because right now during the pandemic, all those businesses are closed. They aren't spending it at all.
So how do you revitalize those small businesses? Just continue not spending on them?
No, you shift that money into the Social Security fund, which then allows retirement people to start spending on things that are necessary.
But
thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech and affirmation, I now call for a speech and negation. Are there any such speeches? Representative Gandhi, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. This is Representative Gandhi speaking for the first time in today's legislative session. At the leisure of all those above me, please give me any indication when you're ready. Awesome. The Great Depression was a time of high insecurity for the most vulnerable, but FDR passed the Social Security Act to ensure that the most vulnerable could stay afloat. Today, when we're faced in another time of need, when this fund is almost out, we're proposed a solution to remove the payroll tax cap to fund the Social Security Fund. But supposedly, while this bill provides a hand to the needy, it is fake and falls away before it can help. So for the following two reasons, that one, this bill forces low-skilled workers out of their jobs, and two, that this bill will fuel wealth inequality, I urge a strong negation of today's bill. First, negate with me because this bill is going to force low-skilled workers out of their jobs because employees will have to match their payroll tax. Now, this is the key point that Representative Rubas mentioned earlier in today's debate and was ignored for the rest of the debate. Representative Rubas talked about how the payroll tax is paid half by companies and half by the employers. Now, Representative Rubas mentioned a great point of how small businesses will hurt, but let's look to the impacts on large businesses and our constituents. So what's going to happen? happen when these companies have to match this payroll tax is that large earners like CEOs and high-ranking officials are going to be paying a lot more, and thus these companies will be paying a lot more as well. However, these companies aren't going to be laying off these CEOs, representatives. They're going to be laying off those at the bottom and the lowest skilled workers. US News says in 2019 that companies already have the resources to automate, with 20,000 jobs going to be lost by 2031. So what this means is that when we pass this bill, these employers are going to have to pay a lot more money, and thus they're going to push the cost onto the lowest skilled workers and employ the use of automation to take them out of their jobs. Representative Mukherjee, while we might increase the access to educational opportunities, understand that they can't get these in the first place if they don't have the income to do that. Representative Ramachandra, yes, this bill might sustain welfare, but these constituents can't get welfare if they don't have wages and they're not paying into it anyways. And Representative Vade, when you talk about how Social Security will help the poor spend the money in the areas they need to, that's going to be long term. But in the short term, these constituents won't have jobs to do that. So representatives, second, negate with me, because this bill is going to fuel the wealth inequality by giving the rich high Social Security checks and not giving them to the poor. Now, Representative Shaw, you talked about how this bill is going to tax the rich, so we're ultimately decreasing the wealth gap. But understand that the way the Social Security works is that the more you pay, the more you're going to receive. Washington Post says in 2019 that if millionaires pay Social Security tax on all their income, their benefits will be incredibly high, with those earning $1 million earning nearly $160,000 a year on Social Security checks. So Representative Chen, yes, these constituents do get less money as they increase their income, but ultimately only the wealthy are going to be getting this money. Every single representative in the affirmation has argued that this will increase the Social Security fund, but ultimately this is only for the rich.
Thank you, Representative Gandhi, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placard. Representative Chen and Representative Mukherjee.
So didn't the studies that basically speculated on the solvency of Social Security account for the fact that removing the payroll tax cap gives the wealthy more benefits?
So Representative, what I'm saying is that under this bill, we're giving only the wealthy benefits, right? In my first contention, I proved to you how these low-income workers are going to be laid off. And then moving on from that, these wealthy are going to be the only ones getting the benefit in the first place.
But the wealthy pay in more and they ensure solvency, right?
Yeah, while they ensure solvency, we're going to see several of these low-income workers laid off, meaning they're not going to get these Social Security checks in the first place because they're not paying into it. So what's happening here is that only the wealthy are getting the money, and the low-income constituents are not getting any of these Social Security checks.
Going off the previous line of questioning, how are low-income constituents not getting checks?
So as I showed in my first contention, these constituents are going to be laid off, meaning they're not going to be paying into Social Security. And if they're
how many people are going to be laid off?
I can't quantify it, but what I can tell you is that these companies have the resources to resort to automation and lay thousands of these constituents off.
But Representative, you said automation was inevitable, so why is this bill a net harm then?
This accelerates it, and while automation is inevitable, they can expand it and now have an incentive to expand it because they're going to have this tax, meaning they're going to be cutting a lot of losses.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation.
Motion.
Representative Mukherjee, please state your motion.
Motion to move to previous questioning.
There's a motion on the floor to previous question. All in favor of previous questioning Bill 101, please raise your placards. All opposed? Representative Gandhi, you're opposed? Okay. Okay, so 16-0, we are moving to previous question. All in favor of passing Bill 101, please raise your placard. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in favor of passing. All opposed of passing Bill 101. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Seeing as the tie is 8-8, I believe as the presiding officer, I can break the tie. And in the spirit of ending gridlock in Washington, I am going to vote in affirmation. So Bill 101 passes.
Motion.
Representative Rubis, please state your motion.
Being a natural break in debate, I call for a 5-minute recess.
Is there a second? Many seconds. Okay. All in favor of a 5-minute recess, please raise your placard. Okay, 5-minute recess starting now.
Okay, before everyone takes off, real quick, I've got 2 orders of business. First of all, before finals, I was on Facebook, so I just wanted to say happy birthday, Representative Halfman. Yeah. Well, but anyway, I think we should do the split for the next bill real quick.
Wait, real quick though, we gotta sing after finals is over, right? Sorry, Janine.
Yeah, I appreciate the wishes.
Yeah, absolutely. So then we'll do the splits real quick. So the next bill, we're going to table 201s. We're doing 301. This is the bill regarding mandatory voting. Affirmative speakers, raise your placards. Oh no, not enough people flipped. Okay, so we still have only 4 affirmative speakers. Negative speakers, raise your placards.
Wait, I
Oh,
have a
5?
question.
Okay.
In the chat, you guys said 302 was next.
Or, sorry, did I
301.
say 301? Yeah. Next, we're going to do the mandatory voting.
Yeah.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. We might have some people who like aren't voting or some people are prepped on both sides. So
neg heavy or F heavy?
it was looking
Neg
a little
heavy.
bit neg heavy.
Very
So
neg
if you're on the neg,
Did anyone flip?
I think one person did because we had one more.
I can
I
flip
have one
F. I can go F as well.
okay, wonderful.
Yeah, I think we're like 7 to 9 or 8 to 8. We're fine.
Well, I guess I'll turn off my camera as well.
Eric, I can stay on with you if you want.
Okay, bet. Let's go. Buddies.
Real quick, Representative Ramachandra's Wi-Fi cut out. He just texted me. So is it possible if we end the recess and he's not back, we could extend it by like a minute or 2 just to make sure he gets here?
Yes. Mr. Dong, are you on here?
Hi, yeah, what's up?
Apparently we have a student whose Wi-Fi cut out.
Oh, bummer.
I don't know if am I allowed to let people in?
Yes, you have the ability to.
I'm a co-host.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Yep.
Okay. Just making
And you can, whatever you need to do to the recess is your discretion, so.
Okay. Which representative's Wi-Fi cut out?
Representative Ramachandra, he's texting me right now. He doesn't know what happened, but yeah, we might need to like extend a minute or 2. Also, quick question: given that it is base 2, is it possible to like extend the session if needed? I don't know if we'll need that though.
Whatever it takes for everyone to have 2 speeches. I should have explained that at the beginning, but the moment that no one has a speech or a motion, then the session is over. But everyone can give 2 speeches. They don't have to, but they can.
Okay, so just a quick point of inquiry. Do we follow the precedents that's been set during the session, or is it another one is created for the new bill?
I'll explain that when everyone comes back, but there's a whole new speaking order. So the precedent that was set for the first bill is not the same second bill.
Got it, okay.
All right, our 5 minutes of recess are up. I am going to assume the people with their cameras on are the ones who are in the chamber. It's come to my attention that we have a representative whose Wi-Fi is cut out and is not with us right now, so I will entertain any other motions. Representative Chen.
I move to recess until Representative Ramachandran reconnects.
I would like a time limit on that.
Okay.
We can revisit it at that time.
Like 3 minutes.
Okay, 3-minute recess. Is there a second? Representative Jordan seconds it. All in favor of a 3-minute recess, please raise your placard. Okay, we are going to recess an additional 3 minutes.
Sorry, judges, I apologize. My internet cut out and I had some difficulties joining. Are we recessing currently?
We are currently recessing an additional 3 minutes for you. So
okay, I'm sorry about the holdup.
No worries, no worries. There's still 2.5 minutes left if you want to get situated.
Got it. Thank you.
There's about 55 seconds left of recess for those of you who are needing to get settled. All right, our 3-minute recess is up. I'm seeing a couple of judges whose cameras are not on. If you guys are with us, could you turn them on so I know we're ready to start? All right, all of the judges are back. It looks like all of our representatives are back, and we are ready to begin the second session. Before I begin, I just want to make sure everyone is clear. The speaking order, everyone has spoken once now, and the speaking order for going forward is a completely different random order of students' names. So please don't put any weight on when you spoke last, Bill. It's a totally different order that I have for you, and it's totally random. So it will take me some time, especially for the first few speeches, to figure out who is highest up. And as far as questions, I am keeping track of how many questions I've given everyone. So I'm doing my best. Again, it's not a scientific thing, but I'm doing my best to give everyone approximately an equal number of questions, as well as trying to allow you to have a little clash and question people who are refuting your points. So I'm doing that the best I can. Are there any questions?
Point of personal privilege?
Yes.
Would you mind if I rejoin on a different device? My internet is back up again.
Sure.
Perfect. Thank you.
We will wait for Representative Ramachandra to do that. I think, though, while he's doing that, if I overheard correctly, you guys are thinking about tabling Bill 201. So I'll just open the floor so that we can get that taken care of while he's rejoining. Are there any motions?
Motion.
Representative Gandhi.
I motion to table Bill 201.
All right, there is a motion on the floor to table Bill 201. Is there a second? Representative Halfman is a second. All in favor of tabling Bill 201, please raise your placard. All of, oh, that's unanimous. Okay. So Bill 201 is tabled, which means we are moving to Bill 302. So Bill 302 comes to the floor. If there are no objections, I will waive the reading of Bill 302, a bill to make voting mandatory. Seeing no objections, I now call for a speech and affirmation. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards for Bill 302. Are there any motions at this time?
Motion.
Representative Fay.
Motion for a quick 30-second recess.
Is there a second? There is a second. All in favor of a 30-second recess, please raise your placard. Okay, 30-second recess is granted.
Okay, I remember there were at least like 5 affirmative speeches prepared. Are any of those sponsorships that could be given right now? Okay, I guess that's a no, because like nobody's stood up as well. Could anyone like turn it into a sponsorship so we could just start debate on 302, or is it? Because otherwise we could extend the recess if someone wants to prepare a sponsorship. Okay, I guess.
I'll sponsor. I'll try to turn mine into a sponsorship.
The 30-second recess is up. Are there any other motions before we begin?
Motion?
Representative Kumar.
Motion for a brief 3-minute recess?
Is there a second? Okay. I guess we need to vote on that. All in favor of a 3-minute recess, please raise your placard. Okay, 3-minute recess. 30 seconds left. All right, that is our 3-minute recess. Before we begin, I got a private chat from one of the judges asking about the number of questions. I am keeping track of it myself, but it's a good idea for me to kind of make that transparent to I'm not making it available to the participants, but to the judges. For those of you looking at the sheet with the speaking order, I've added a column for how many questions each speaker has had. So if you could also hold me accountable, and if I'm ignoring someone and you're noticing it, please send me a chat and let me know, so that we're fair to everyone. So I think we're ready to begin. Bill 302 comes to the floor. I now look for a speaker in affirmation. Is there such a speaker? Representative Mukherjee, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. This is Representative Mukherjee speaking for the second and final time in today's legislative session. And of course, as always, I'm at the leisure of my PO and judges. And PO, if you could give me that final thumbs up when all of the judges are ready, that'd be perfect. All of them are ready?
Oh, I'm sorry. All of them.
Okay.
They're all ready.
They're all ready? That's perfect. 160 million people voted in the 2020 election. Now that's a significant portion of our population, yet that was only 2/3 of the eligible voters in the United States. We need to make sure that we encourage all Americans that are of eligible age to vote to make sure that the President of the United States or any federally elected representative or senator represents all of the people. And we do that by passing today's legislation, making voting mandatory for any person above the age of 18 and who is a naturalized citizen. So yes, today's legislation will make voting mandatory, but I also want to look at two other key parts of today's legislation. So for the following two reasons that this bill benefits workers and allows felons to vote, we passed today's piece of legislation. So first, let's look at why today's piece of legislation benefits workers, and that's clearly stated in Section 1. So Section 1 states that all employers shall be required to compensate workers for their time voting. That means that now voters are allowed to leave their work and will still be paid for the time that they leave that work. So according to Pew Research Center, they surveyed registered voters who didn't vote, and they found that 35% of them who didn't vote had scheduling conflicts with work that kept them from going to the polls at all. That is a significant portion of that survey that shows that going to work is a significant barrier for people who do not vote. And that's because there is no federal law requiring employers to give off time to work. But this legislation clearly does that. So representatives on the negation are going to come up here and tell you that this bill does not address enough barriers, but they need to understand that a significant portion of our voting population isn't voting because they are not going to get compensated when they go to work. But let's also look to Section 2 of today's legislation, where it states that American citizens eligible to vote shall be defined as naturalized or natural-born citizens 18 years or older. Nowhere in that definition does it talk about disenfranchised felons. Let's look at why that's so important for minority voices. Now, according to the Sentencing Project, 1 in 16 African Americans of voting age are disenfranchised. That significantly suppresses African American voices in this country. But when we pass today's legislation and allow felons to vote, we can make sure that minority turnout increases, therefore making sure that everyone in our federal elections recognizes how important minority voices are to the constituency. We passed today's legislation to ensure that our policies are inclusive of people who vote who want to vote but they can't vote because they go to work, and of minorities who can't practice their right to vote because they are disenfranchised. We need to make sure that we always care for our constituency and listen to our constituency by passing today's piece of legislation.
Thank you, Representative Mukherjee, for that 2-minute and 59-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Gandhi and Representative Fay.
Hey, Representative. So
Hi.
do these minority constituents always have access to the polls and other means of voting?
Probably not.
Okay, so if these constituents don't have access, and as you said, so if these constituents don't have access, then doesn't that mean that we're going to end up fining them? Which is
Well, no, not necessarily. One way that they don't technically have access is voter ID laws. Now, this is something I didn't mention in my speech, but voter ID laws aren't as high as $150.
Beyond voter ID laws, though, there's other restrictions, right? Such as travel that they can't get to. So if they
Representative
literally
Fay.
can't.
Okay, hi, Representatives. So how many of our impoverished constituents are currently unemployed?
I don't have that number off the top of my head.
Okay, it could be said that it's a significant amount, right?
Sure.
Okay, so under today's legislation, it specifically states that employers shall be required to compensate these workers for their time voting. That means that our unemployed constituents won't be receiving the compensation under today's legislation. Doesn't that mean that they are actually going to be disproportionately affected by this bill if we're requiring them to vote?
Well, sure, but as I stated in the research that I talked about.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for a speech in negation. Is there such a speech? Representative. Representative Chen, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Representative Chen speaking for the second time this session. As always, any indication when everyone's ready. Good, great, awesome. Is anyone not ready? In August of 2018, attendees of a computer science convention infiltrated American voting systems in just 10 minutes. 10 minutes to destroy 200 years of democracy. Today, by passing today's legislation, this Congress risks making the same mistake. Fail for one reason and one reason only, because today's legislation is fundamentally undemocratic because it forces millions of Americans into a cycle of poverty. Now, in the first speech of today's round, Representative Mukherjee told us that today's bill would remove barriers to voting, like felony voting and people not having time in their schedules. And under Section 1A, we fine people who don't vote $150. Here's the issue. Even if we remove some barriers to voting, as long as we don't remove all of them, there are still going to be millions of Americans who are unable to access the polls, which means that they're going to have to pay a fine. The Census Bureau quantifies this in 2018 when they find that 7.4% of Americans were unable to register to vote because of restrictive voter ID laws. The Institute for Racial Justice at Harvard further explains that in order to comply with these ID laws, low-income constituents without an ID would have to pay as much as $1,500. So Representative Mukherjee, today's legislation creates a catch-22. For the over 5 million Americans who are being suppressed in the status quo, they either pay $1,500 to vote or they pay the $150 fee under today's legislation. But the impact of this goes beyond fairness. Because as the ACLU explains in September of 2020, those affected by these stringent voter ID laws are both from minority communities and lower income, meaning that the impact of $150 is magnified. That could be a week's groceries. That could be a month's rent. Representative Mukherjee, I want to enfranchise minority and economically disenfranchised communities. But the last way to do that is to impose a massive fiscal burden on them. The Vera Institute for Justice further explains in October of 2020 that fees like the one proposed in Section 1 have a history of spiraling out of control. Tens of thousands of Americans go to jail because of their inability to pay fines. Moreover, the deck is stacked against them. The system is structured to add on hundreds of dollars of fines if a defendant is unable to pay, creating an inescapable cycle of debt for millions of Americans. Here's the impact. 5.92 million Americans that are affected by voter ID laws are now put into a cycle of poverty. Representative Mukherjee, the worst way to ensure democratic representation is to economically disenfranchise millions of Americans. Every future affirmative speaker that comes up here and talks about democracy must weigh their impact against the millions that we suppress, the millions that we keep under. 10 minutes to destroy democracy. One negation ballot to save it.
Thank you, Representative, for that 2-minute and 58-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Saxena and Representative Bopana.
Hi, Representative. The bill says that if you are eligible to vote, then you have to pay. If voters aren't eligible to vote because of voter ID laws, then how will they be fined?
Right, so the issue is the definition of eligibility in Section 2. It defines eligible voters as all voters above 18 years old and who are citizens. That doesn't include those who can't register because of voter ID.
But if they physically cannot vote because of states' individual voting laws, doesn't that mean that despite the bill's definition, there are other definitions that they still have to answer to?
No, the bill's definition
Representative
classifies
Bopana.
eligible voters.
In Section 1, this legislation specifically states that employers will compensate for whatever cost the employee has when they go to vote.
Right, so the issue isn't employers, it's state-level legal barriers that today's legislation fails to address.
But doesn't federal legislation supersede all state barriers?
Not necessarily, because today's legislation doesn't explicitly address state-level regulation because it is such a broad definition for voter eligibility.
But that doesn't
Thank
matter.
you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placard. Representative Ramachandra, you raise your placard unopposed.
All right, I thank the chair. All right, good evening, everyone. This is Representative Ramachandra speaking for the second time in this legislative session. As always, I'm at the leisure of those above me. So judges and PO, please give me a sign of indication when you're ready. Perfect. Judges, how are we doing? Good. All right. Let's not beat around the bush. Our American political system has stagnated because increasing polarization means that we are too diverted to actually make changes that benefit our American constituents. A lack of competitiveness in our elections is facilitating this because there is no incentive to change, but this bill provides an opportunity to change that. Affirm this bill because it, 1, reduces political polarization, and 2, increases the quality of elections. So first, affirm this bill because it reduces political polarization. That's because when you tap into an audience of voters that previously has not gone to the polls by mandating that they go vote, it increases the moderate representation that we have in our precincts. According to Quillette, in November 2019, American politics have become increasingly partisan. 6 in 10 Americans believe that both the Republican and Democratic Party are not working for the interests of Americans. So we see that increasing partisanship is causing Americans to lose confidence in our government. But let's see why this bill is going to provide a solution. Because according to Pacific Standard in May 2017, the voting audience is more partisan than all eligible voters in general, and that a mandate for voting actually increases moderate participation in elections. So we see that given that the current audience of who actually goes to vote is more partisan, when we mandate that people who go vote, that everyone go vote, we see that we tap into a moderate audience that's able to regulate this partisanship. Let's look at what impact that has. Because according to Greater Good magazine in July 2019, polarization reduces the effectiveness of Congress and policy and creates general tension. So we see that partisanship is a plague that is infecting the effectiveness of our policy. But when Section 1 of this bill mandates that all Americans that are eligible to vote go vote, that means that we tap into a moderate audience that's able to regulate partisanship. So when Representative Chen comes up here and talks about the impacts of how this bill imposes a $150 fine and doesn't address voting barriers, he fails to recognize that we not only compensate these workers for the time that they spent to go vote, but he fails to quantify whether the cost of actually getting photo ID is greater than $150. So when you look at that, you realize you need to affirm to decrease political polarization. But next, affirm this bill because it improves the quality of elections. With decreased polarization, it means that elections are going to become more competitive and more people will participate. According to Harvard Business Review in 2020, the reasons that elections have stagnated is because increased political polarization with two political parties is going to decrease the general quality of the election and the platforms that people take. But when Section 1 of this bill mandates that all Americans go vote, when we see that increased audience of people that are moderate go to vote, we decrease this political polarization. And when there's less political polarization, we improve the quality of our elections because partisanship is what has been holding us back in the past. Affirm this bill and increase the integrity of our elections by removing polarization.
Thank you, Representative Ramachandra, for that 2-minute and 58-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Chen and Representative Shaw.
So how can you say that this bill costs less than photo ID if I quantified for you in my speech that the cost of all necessary documentation is up to $1,500?
Okay, so first of all, not only are we going to be compensating workers for the time that they actually spend going to precincts, but we see that so we also have that $150 fine. So those basically act as incentives.
But how does that offset the $1,500 burden that 5 million Americans need to vote?
Okay, I completely understand your concern, but we also have to keep in mind that we are providing government stimulus, so they're not completely out of cash, but we also compensate them for the time they spend.
Representative, aren't these new voters who tend to be moderates also less educated, meaning about the issues, meaning that they won't be able to make the best and most informed decisions?
No, there's no correlation between being more moderate and less educated. That's completely false.
But you said these individuals are moderate because they haven't voted in the past. Doesn't their lack of experience?
I'm just saying that they voluntarily choose not to participate in elections because they're inherently more partisan.
Representative, how do you manage to register this huge influx of new voters into the system?
So first of all, we provide monetary.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for a speech in negation. Are there any such speeches? Representative Fay, you have the floor.
This is Representative Fay speaking for the second time this legislative session. As always, I'm at the leisure of my PO and judges. If everyone could just give me a thumbs up when you're ready. All right. Oh, I think that's everyone. Yeah, okay, I'll just proceed. Cornfields as far as the eye can see. Those are the sights from my home state of Illinois. And it's those sights that our rural constituents are going to be seeing when we force them under today's legislation to go to their designated polling locations and require them to have a mandatory vote. It's for the following piece of contention that today's legislation inevitably harms rural communities that I urge the strong negation of today's legislation. Now, first, Representatives Mukherjee and Ramachandra on the affirmation of today's debate have treated the fact that we are compensating workers for the time that they spend voting as the end-all be-all for the necessary compensation that we need under today's legislation. But they couldn't be more wrong. Specifically, they failed to understand that without the proper infrastructure for our rural constituents to actually access their polling locations, that today's legislation is going to fail. But in order to understand that, let's take a specific look at the text of today's legislation. Specifically, under Section 1, it states that American citizens eligible to vote who do not will be fined $150 per absence from voting. The issue that arises from this is the definition for absence in Section 2. Specifically, it states that an absence from voting is when a citizen does not appear at their designated polling site to cast a ballot. That means that every single mandatory vote we are requiring under today's legislation is going to have to happen in person. That is especially detrimental for our rural constituents. Specifically, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures in 2014, typically local jurisdictions prefer in-person voting, which is going to be mandated under today's legislation inevitably. This is an issue because the sheer size of some rural jurisdictions means that transportation is an especially divisive issue for these voters. And it's also harder for them to obtain the required identification in order to actually vote. This means that for the vast majority of our rural constituents, they're going to have to be forced to pay this $150 fine because they can't actually show up to vote under today's legislation. This is an issue specifically according to the Housing Assistance Council in a 2012 research brief in which they stated that nearly a quarter of those in poverty live in rural areas. We are essentially telling the people who can't afford to actually go to these locations that you're going to be fined because there's not enough infrastructure for you to actually travel there. That's something that I, as a congressperson, can't stand for. But next, let's understand that the compensation that we're providing for workers isn't enough, specifically because according to the Housing Assistance Council in June of 2020, they state that rural unemployment is currently sitting at 8.8% as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. That is 1.8 million people in these rural communities who currently don't have a job, which means that under today's legislation, they aren't going to be receiving the compensation from their workers for the time that they actually need to travel to these voting locations. That means that we're essentially robbing them of their ability to actually vote, while at the same time, we're fining them for doing so. So Representatives Mukherjee and Ramachandra understand that the compensation we're providing under today's legislation is nowhere near enough for the people who actually need it. Stand with me in the negation under today's legislation because it fundamentally fails to understand that we're negatively impacting the
Thank you, Representative, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Ramachandra and Representative Reddy.
Hi, Representative. So if someone casts a mail-in ballot from a rural community, what happens? Does it just not count?
Okay. So specifically, it states under Section 2 that essentially an absence from voting is when a citizen does not appear at a polling location. Essentially, what that does is that means that every single vote that's required under today's legislation is going to have to happen in person.
Okay, but is mail-in ballot a form of voting, right?
Technically it is, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
not technically, it is a form of voting. Yeah.
So rural communities can still participate in elections by
Right.
casting
They
mail-in
don't
ballots.
even have the infrastructure for that. Specifically, they rely on the U.S. Postal Service, which is already
Representative
facing
Reddy.
issues due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Hi, so aren't polling places basically chosen because of the convenience for like people nearby, so like libraries and schools?
Okay, specifically, that doesn't really apply to these rural locations because of their sheer size and because there's so many people spread out across such a large area that it's inefficient for them to actually provide so many easy to access polling locations. I already proved to you that because of the sheer size of them, it's harder for these rural.
Okay, but absentee voting, the fact that their vote can count, isn't that like, aren't there like federal allotments so that can still happen? So even if they pay the fine, they can still.
That doesn't matter. Literally under this
Thank
bill,
you,
we're fining
Representative.
them if they don't
Thank
show
you,
up.
Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation. Is there such a speech? Representative Shaw, you raise your placard unopposed.
I thank the chair. Good afternoon once again, everyone. My name is Representative Shaw from H.D. Jacobs High School, speaking for the second and of course final time this legislative session. As always, I'm at the leisure of my PO and judges. Please give me any indication when you're ready for me to begin. 302 pro is the bill. PO, when all the judges are ready, can you give me a second thumbs up?
Everyone's ready.
Thank you. Representatives, elections play a distinctive role for strengthening democracy, and voting is a pivotal part of that process. But without participation, we see a myriad of challenges in the representation of our people. Today, like we had in 1776, with our minds set on democracy, we have a plan for the revolution that America so desperately needs. It's for the two key reasons that today's legislation shifts the focus of elections truly back to policy proposals, and that it will lead to the formation of policies that are more inclusive of socioeconomically disadvantaged and rural groups. I urge for a strong vote in the affirmation today. So first, let's examine how compulsory voting in federal elections impacts the way which candidates approach campaign spending. I turned to Brookings in March of 2018, which says that when Australia enacted compulsory voting, the most money spent on elections was around mobilizing people, and campaign funds saw a sharp drop. All political parties responded to a survey saying that they don't spend as much money on advertising. Simply put, elections in which citizens are required to vote also have less money involved in the process. And that's because it's well established that more individuals will come out to vote, so they don't need to spend as much on advertising. Campaigns and candidates then become more truly focused on their purpose, one that is more policy focused. Right now, campaigns and parties worry about how they can earn from PACs and super PACs to do their best to outdo their opponent. But today's legislation reshifts priorities to American policy. Negation speakers like Representative Chen and Representative Fay both bring up the necessity for increased spending for establishing new polling locations or enforcing this legislation, but they both miss out on the increased savings in the election process that can be put towards both of these processes. We need to elect people based on their policies, not the size of their pockets, so we must affirm. Now next, let's examine how, unlike what Representative Chen and Representative Fay say, today's legislation will lead to improvements for marginalized, rural, and low-income communities. I turned to the Hill in November of 2019, which says that after compulsory voting was introduced nationwide in Australia in 1924, the country increased its spending on pensions, an issue that was particularly important for progressives at the time. Countries where voting is mandatory experience greater distribution of wealth at the polls and spend more on domestic issues and less on defense. And that's because government officials and candidates know more of the country is watching them. When we pass today's legislation, we shift our priorities from favoring the wealthy for earning their donations to now the people that really make up our country, our low income and rural constituents. When Representative Chen says we are going to place these people into a cycle of poverty, he fails to see the long-term effects of shifting election priorities. And when Representative Fay claims that there is no support for rural America, today's legislation will allow the necessary infrastructure to develop based on need. This bill is going to lead to more progressive policies for low income and rural America, so we must affirm. Representatives, it's for the previous two reasons that today's legislation will cause a transition to focus elections back on policy, not on spending, and that it's going to directly benefit low-income individuals, minorities, and rural America, that I urge for a strong vote in the affirmation today.
Thank you, Representative Shaw, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Halfman and Representative Gandhi.
You claim that in the long term, we're going to shift our priorities to low-income constituents. But in the short term, how does this impact them?
It's going to allow them to have access and more of a say in our democratic process so that in the long term, like I said, we shift our priorities to where they're struggling and where they truly need the help, like setting up polling locations and the infrastructure they need to get out to vote.
So what about businesses that employ minorities? What's their ability to afford the compensation versus other businesses?
There's no correlation.
Representative Gandhi.
Hey, Representative. So, can't advertisements be good if they're spreading information about the candidates' policies?
Yeah, and I completely agree that there are definitely during elections and during federal elections, there are advertising that is spent more for education purposes. But right now, what we're seeing in the status quo is that too much money is being spent on campaign spending. And now with today's legislation, we can shift our priorities back to policy.
Yeah, but that campaign spending includes this advertisement being spent on educating people, correct? And isn't that better if our voter base is more informed?
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you.
Seeing as that was a speech and affirmation, I now call for a speech and negation. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Representative Rubis, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. Hello, everyone. My name is Representative Rubis. That's spelled R-U-B-A-S. So excited to be speaking for the second time today. If my judges could just let me know if you're not ready, I'll give you about 10 seconds here. And if everyone's ready at that point, we'll get started. Wonderful. If that's the case, we'll get started then. The beauty of American democracy is not the choices we make for Americans. It's the power we give them to make choices themselves. This Congress should not dictate how anyone lives their lives. Rather, we give them the power to live their lives the way they want to. Ultimately, it's because this legislation chooses to silence the voices of Americans through corporate donations and political polarization. You have to fail. First, fail this legislation to prevent an influx of corporate donations. So far in this debate, my side has ran away from addressing the actual core arguments, conceding that if states didn't interfere, mandatory voting would be good. Let me rumble where they fumbled and take the affirmative at their highest ground. Even if everyone can vote, it is still worth failing this bill. Representative Shaw champions for the affirmation that mandatory voting increases representation for marginalized groups. This argument is like a fat hummingbird. It may sound pretty, but it will never fly. Michelle Hoffman of the National Bureau for Economic Research explains in May of 2016 that in a meta-study of compulsory voting in 30 countries, it led to a marked increase in turnout, but no increase in social spending or programs designed to help these low-income families. And the reason why is simple. Mr. Shaw tells you that this decreases the need for advertisement. Mr. Shaw, I could not disagree more. When you need more people to vote for you, you also need to advertise more. That's a problem because it means you need more financial support. Nathan Katz from the University of Missouri argues in 2018 that corporate donations contribute to 80% of advertisements in presidential elections. In essence, when you pass, it's not the marginalized groups that get more representation. It's American big businesses. But second, fail this bill to prevent political polarization. Mr. Ramachandra tells you that this legislation decreases political polarization. Mr. Ramachandra, that is categorically false because it's not about appealing to your voters. It's about staying beholden to your corporate overlords. That's bad because as Richard Piles, a law professor in UPenn, tells us in February of 2020, studies show that large corporate donations are almost always radically red or radically blue. Mr. Shaw, when candidates get into office because of advertisements from corporate donations, their policies and decisions are at the mercy of the corporations that put them there, meaning that they're less likely to be moderate and cross party lines for compromises. It's this lack of moderation that causes government shutdowns. The Guardian explains in January 11th of 2019 just how harmful these can be. Because when the government struggles to pay overhead costs and funding is cut, it cuts welfare programs. In fact, in the last couple government shutdowns, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security were all put on pause. These are monumental programs that are key to the livelihoods of tens of millions. We cannot afford to jeopardize them. It is a privilege to speak on platitudes, but for the person who has never seen, that has never spoke, that should be spoken for in this Congress, I ask the speakers of the affirmation, who did you speak
Thank
over?
you, Representative Rubis, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Bade and Representative Mukherjee.
Hey, Representative. So in the status quo, don't most politicians spend a majority of their funds on increasing voter turnout? Doesn't that mean
Absolutely not. That's not true at all. The vast majority of their money goes to advertisement.
Right. Those advertisements increase voter turnout. Those advertisements are to increase people's ability to go out and vote.
It's to get people to vote for them, sure.
Right. So now they don't have to, no, they increase voter turnout just in general. They no longer have to spend money.
Politicians don't want you to come out and vote for the other candidate. Advertisements are targeted at getting them to vote for you.
Right. But now specifically, they don't need to.
Representative Mukherjee.
Hi, Representative. Why would presidential candidates stay beholden to corporations over voters when voters are the people voting these people into office?
Because voters watch ads and vote based off of them. That's the entire determination of our current election system. If you need to advertise more, you need more corporate money.
But why is there still more corporate influence than voter influence?
Because 80% of advertisements are funded by corporations. You cannot win without those.
So how's this bill perpetuating that at all if it's already the majority?
Because it increases voter turnout.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as how that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation. Is there such a speech? Representative Wu, you have the floor.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Representative Wu. Second time today. I'm on the affirmative. W, still spelled W. Any indication when you're ready? I'm happy to begin. Excellent. Just pin my PO. This very Congress, no, this very nation has waged a decades-long war for the franchise. From Susan B. Anthony and her campaign for women's suffrage, W.E. Du Bois and his firebrand advocacy for equality at the ballot box for people of color, and MLK and his Selma March to fight against systemic barriers, I am now here to make a very bold proclamation. Today's legislation is the only way to move the legacy of those social justice champions forward in a way that cures the root cause of political disaffection. This is not a prosecution of the status quo. It is a defense of democracy that is on death's doorsteps. In the status quo, the prolific disenfranchisement of marginalized populations means that subjugated voices aren't just insignificant, they are subterranean. The American Political Science Review explains in 2017 that the root cause of all political disaffection in a survey of 20,000 respondents was overwhelmingly a perceived lack of political empowerment. When people's access to the ballot box is systematically stripped, they no longer have any interest or incentive in participatory democracy, because regardless of how that inclusive democracy functions, it will never be reflective of their needs. Let's issue a couple responses to the disenfranchisement argument advanced by Representatives Chen and Fei. First, if Representative Mukherjee already proves to you in the first cycle of this debate that the single greatest barrier to voter turnout for low-income Americans is that they can't afford to take time off work to vote, at the very least, passing this bill eliminates some barriers to voting, allowing a new influx of voters to participate in federal elections and make their voices heard. But after all, as Representative Chen points out, that isn't enough to affirm. Here's the rub. This policy also helps to eliminate other state-level barriers by enfranchising more eligible voters to vote in politicians more responsive to their policy preferences. A comprehensive analysis conducted by the University of Rochester in 2019 of dozens of voting acts dating back to the Kennedy administration revealed that whenever we reduce some voting barriers, we forge a path for poor and working-class voters who can vote to vote, in which 7.8 of every 10 cases means more progressive candidates, more committed to fighting systemic barriers, are voted into office. Do not let the negation convince you that passing this bill galvanizes millions of uneducated, bad faith voters into our system, when Black and brown communities have been fighting for this right for decades. But lastly, this also transforms political engagement tactics. Representative Rubis asserts that this legislation increases the influence of big businesses. But like Representative Vade tells you in examination, it actually frees up more resources currently devoted to advertising and turning out voters to persuasion and voter education, requiring all candidates to focus on all voters, not just likely ones. This solution ensures that no one falls in between the gaps.
Thank you, Representative, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Shah and Representative Ramachandra.
Representative, when we make voting a civic duty rather than a civic freedom, aren't we sending Americans the wrong message that a participatory democracy is no longer a liberty, but an obligation?
Insofar as millions of Black and brown voters have been fighting for this right since the 1960s, I'd argue that making this mandatory is not forcing them to do anything. It's just reaffirming what they already want and desire.
Isn't today's legislation making voting compulsory, meaning that it's no longer a liberty Americans can enjoy? Doesn't that turn them away from voting?
Representative
No, because
Ramachandra.
there's an incentive to vote.
Representative Ramachandra.
So if there's an increased population of people that are just going to polls arbitrarily, then why wouldn't people increase financing for elections in order to advertise and cater to those people?
Because right now, as Representative Rubis pointed out to you in his speech, the majority of funding is currently going to advertising and turning out the proportion of the electorate that's likely to vote. In the case where the 100% of the electorate does have to vote, politicians outreach to everyone. That's a net benefit.
Wouldn't this legislation?
Thank you, Representative Wu. Seeing as that was a speech and affirmation, I now call for a speech negation. Is there such a speech? Representative Jordan, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. That's Representative Jordan speaking for the second time this legislative session. Of course, I'm at the leisure of all those above me. So PO, if you could give me a thumbs up if all the judges and you are ready. Great, thank you so much. The United States as a country prides itself on being somewhat progressive in providing basic human rights to our constituents. For instance, in the First Amendment of the Constitution, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, right to peacefully assemble, etc. But most importantly, we pride ourselves on the free speech we provide to Americans because of this vote in negation, because it is unconstitutional by prohibiting the freedom of speech and infringes on some religions. Not only does this bill not solve because it doesn't help representation and political activity as those above me in the negation have brought up, it is just simply unconstitutional. This bill is unconstitutional because the freedom to speak is also protected under freedom of speech. According to US Today 2015, the First Amendment protects not just the right to speak, but the right to refrain from speaking. Not voting can certainly communicate a variety of messages, such as dissatisfaction, being fed up with the two-party system, or even being an anarchist. And according to NTSU in 2018, in a Supreme Court case in 2006, Rumsfeld v. Forum for Academic and Institutional Rights, the court voted and reiterated a principle that the government cannot tell people what they must say. They may refrain from speaking. The same thing happened in another case in 1977, where the court ruled that, quote, the right to speak and the right to refrain from speaking are complementary components of the broader concept of individual freedom of mind. And according to LDF.org, no date, voting and not voting are forms of speech. If crude ones, the government cannot force a citizen to speak. A stronger solution to this bill would be to implement compulsory voting with a checkbox on the ballot and none of the above. This would be a popular option, an alternative to people who are often incredibly dissatisfied with the candidates. We pride ourselves on being the defender of freedom and individual choice, but compulsory voting is a clear violation of this. Not voting is an act of protest. Discontent with the candidates is often a prime reason for people staying home. Unless we have a solution that would serve all the American people, i.e. the check the box for none of the above, this bill eliminates people's freedom of refraining from speaking. Not only this, but this bill goes against some people's religions. According to LA Times, there are several religions who cannot vote, or at least often refrain from voting. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses are often seen as a religion in which people are not allowed to vote, or at least the majority of them do not do so. So when we affirm, we are forcing people to either vote against their religion or have to pay a $150 fine. So no matter what impacts the affirmative may bring up of increased representation, or increase or decrease campaign spending, that does not outweigh the duty we signed as Congresspeople to uphold and defend the Constitution.
to defend the Constitution and help our constituents keep their rights, negate.
Thank you, Representative, for that 2-minute and 42-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Wu and Representative Mukherjee.
Let's talk about this constitutionality objection. Is it our role and responsibility as the legislative branch to rule on matters of constitutionality?
Sure, it might not be our direct role, but we still operate under the Constitution. We are supposed to uphold it. And if we're directly infringing upon the First Amendment constitutional rights, we aren't doing that.
Wait, are you 1000% sure that this legislation violates constitutionality? Because
Yes,
if not, then why don't we just leave this to the courts?
Simple. If we shouldn't leave it to the courts because we're debating it right now in this present time.
Why not pass? And then if it turns out to be
unconstitutional,
repeal it.
Hi, Representative. So kind of going off the previous line of questioning, the Supreme Court ruled that the government cannot tell you what to say. How is voting for a specific candidate telling you what to say?
It's not telling you what to say. It's telling.
But that's what the Supreme Court ruled.
I said that well, according to my evidence, the Supreme Court ruled that we cannot tell them what to do or to say. Not voting is a way of showing that you're discontent or that you're not going to say anything. And we are directly infringing upon that, let alone infringing upon people's religions.
Kind of going off that, how is not
Thank you,
voting...
Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation. Is there such a speech? Representative Kumar. Representative Kumar, you have the floor. I apologize.
Okay, I thank the chair. This is Representative Kumar speaking for the second time today. To my judges and PO, as always, just let me know when you all are ready. Okay. I think I'm waiting on 2 judges. Okay, great, thank you. In a country where the American dream is the prospect of success, it confuses me why this Congress consistently inhibits that very representation. And today, because this legislation advances that dream for so many people, I will be affirming for the following 2 reasons: that we make voting a lot easier and because we incentivize rural communities to vote. First, affirm because today's legislation will make voting a lot easier. Let's break down Representative Chen's point about voter suppression. He tells us that voter ID laws prevent people from voting and that those individuals would be punished under this legislation because of the fine. But understand the reasons for people not having an ID. NPR in April of 2020 explains that for many communities of color who don't vote, the very communities that Representative Chen talks about, they don't find a necessity for an ID because they either don't have the time to find it or they don't find it necessary because they live in the city where having a car is not required because of public transportation. It's not because of the monetary costs that Representative Chen tells you about. So if we pass this legislation, we incentivize those voters to get an ID in order to vote, because this legislation includes a fine, which will act as an incentive. But here's how this legislation crushes the voter suppression Representative Chen describes. Even for those people who can't access the ID because of the so-called $1,500 cost he describes. The LA Times explains in August of 2020, the adoption of a universal civic duty voting would also help shift election laws away from policies that keep some groups from going to the polls, including encouraging same-day registration, pre-registering 16 and 17-year-olds, paid leave to vote, expanded early and mail-in voting, and less voter ID laws. The voter suppression here is not the lack of ID, but the time that so many people don't have to take off from work. And as Representative Mukherjee already explained, today's legislation creates that time that has been for so long deprived from hardworking Americans. But second, pass this legislation to open up voting to rural Americans. Contrary to what Representative Fay tells you, WBUR explains in February of last year that mandatory voting would push the federal government to sponsor get out the vote efforts in rural areas. In these efforts, election workers attempt to set up polling places and get constituents registered to vote. So Representative Fay, when we pass this legislation, we incentivize the government to finally take responsibility for such a large percentage of our population who struggles to vote. Representative Jordan, you talk about unconstitutionality, but if we allow people who for so long have been deprived of their constitutional right to vote, we Allow rights, not take them away, and understand the impact. When we get rural individuals to vote, we expand the amount of people who can vote and thereby expanding campaigning. As Representative Ramachandran already told us, increased campaigning decreases polarization. The New York Times explains in November of 2020 that today's legislation increases competition. And they say that increasing competition increases accountability to voters, not to big corporations, Representative Rubis. Today's legislation finally makes the American dream a reality. That is why you must affirm.
Thank you, Representative, for that 2-minute and 59-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Jordan and Representative Chen.
Representative, so the Chicago Booth in 2016 states that compulsory voting was passed in over 20 countries and representation did not really change. How can you guarantee that it's going to have any solvency in the United States?
Because in the United States, when we pass compulsory voting laws, we also push get out the vote efforts. We also push.
But even if, okay, compulsory voting did the same thing in those other countries and representation didn't change. So how will it directly change in the United States?
Okay, I'm not aware of the situation in other countries because we're talking about the United States, but in the United States, we force states to get rid of a lot of these voter.
Representative Chen.
Does it cost money to get voter ID?
Correct, yes.
How much?
You explained to us up to $1,500 in fines.
Right, so can low-income Americans afford that?
So it's not about not being able to afford it. As I explained in my speech, it's about not having time and it's about not having necessity. If we can encourage so many of these people who see that as a barrier to get an ID and vote, that to me outweighs any impact about a couple of people who don't have a voter ID because they can't afford it.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for a speech in negation. Is there such a speech? Representative Halfman, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. This is Representative Halfman speaking for the second time in the negation. As always, I'm at the leisure of all those above me, so any indication when you're ready. And I think that's everyone, yeah? The only mandatory process in today's debate should not be mandatory voting, but rather the mandatory commitment that we have to represent our constituency. And it's in the spirit of upholding that commitment that I negate today for the two key reasons. That one, today's legislation lacks effective implementation, and two, it disproportionately affects small businesses and minorities. But first, we're failing today's legislation because it lacks effective implementation. Now, Representative Kumar and Wu argued in today's debate that we will be able to facilitate changes in the long term that increase access for minorities to the polls. But understand that the timeline of today's legislation to get this by the 2022 federal elections prevents us from ever seeing the efficacy of this. Now, NPR in November of 2020 did an analysis of different compulsory voting systems across the globe. And when we look at what they involve, there's main factors that include the cost of oversight and administration and the ability to track both the people who do vote and the people who do not. So when we look at how that takes place, for example, in Peru, you need to have a stamp in order to qualify for public benefits. And other countries have various other tracking systems. But today's legislation allocates neither the funding nor the resources nor the requirements to allow us to have efficient tracking. So even if we are able to break down these barriers in the long term, in the short term, when we start to implement this, we are finding people simply based on the inability of the federal government to allocate the time and resources necessary to properly implement compulsory voting. So we fail today's legislation because we do not have the means for effective implementation. But second, let's recognize that this disproportionately affects small businesses and minorities. Now, in today's legislation, we focused on minorities in the context of being able to afford time off of work or their ability to afford the barriers to voting. But let's shift the focus to the employer, not the voter, and understand how it fits into the context of today's legislation that requires compensation for taking time off. Now, the New York Times in January of 2021 outlines that while it takes 10 to 25 minutes for a white voter to get through the polls, in contrast, it takes 50 to 90 minutes for non-white voters. Those are statistics from the 2020 election. So what that means is that small businesses with minority employees or that are situated in minority neighborhoods are going to be facing increased costs to compensate the time spent voting because it represents greater numbers of hours and hourly wages. So So, Representative Mukherjee, you claim this benefits workers and minorities, which was echoed by Representative Shaw in today's debate. But in actuality, those are the very groups harmed by the passage of today's legislation because we fail to take into account how businesses will be disproportionately impacted. So ultimately, the only thing mandatory in today's debate is our responsibility.
Thank you, Representative Hathon, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questions. Questioners, please raise your placard. Representative Kumar and Representative Reddy.
Hi, so if I in my speech explain why when we pass this legislation, we encourage states to make it easier to vote by passing new laws, why does your first contention still stand?
Because of the timeline. As I stated in my first contention, we're implementing this by the federal elections, the Senate elections in 2022. To expect states to completely overhaul their voting laws in less than a year is simply unrealistic.
But don't they have an incentive to do that? Because in order to create more turnout, they need to increase accessibility.
Right, and the ability to.
Hi, so isn't our election and voting system designed basically so that every American who wants to can vote? So why is oversight cost the one thing that we should fail because of?
It's designed to help every American vote, but as has been repeatedly established in today's debate, not only does it fail to accomplish that, but a third of voters chose not to vote in 2020.
All right. And then moving on, for minority disenfranchisement, it's one day that their pay would be cut. Why does that lead to them
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation. Is there such a speech? Representative Bopana, you have the floor.
Thank the chair. This is Representative Bopana speaking for the final time this legislative session. So any indication from IPO and judges, and I'll begin. All right, awesome. One of the most powerful functions within our democracy is the ability to choose our leaders. After all, that choice alone is enough to change the very face of our government and our nation for years. The amount of political dedication needed to make every decision count is massive, which is exactly why we affirm today, for the principal reason that compulsory voting leads to a better informed public. And that reason alone is enough to pass when we go to previous questioning. In the status quo, the principal reason why so many people refrain from voting in elections is mainly due to the fact that people don't feel represented by the politicians they vote for, something that Representative Ramachandra alluded to at the very beginning of this debate. In fact, Christopher Federico, a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota, states that when measuring someone's propensity to vote, it matters whether a person is interested in politics or sees politics as something central to their sense of self. Passing this legislation, however, flips that script and allows for greater education to the constituency in two key ways. First, by incentivizing political officials to focus on policies such as Medicare, tax cuts, or stimulus checks, rather than gleaning participation from narrow constituencies, something that Representative Shaw alluded to. But more importantly, by incentivizing our population to go out to the ballot box that costs in both time and money, we incentivize them to become more politically active. Emily Boot Chapman of Stanford University in 2018 states that compulsory voting can affect the costs and benefits of acquiring political knowledge and forming political judgments in a variety of ways, and indirectly serves as an incentive to become informed. All of the problems that the affirmative talks about, whether it be Representative Chen's concerns for the disenfranchised or Representative Faye's rural voters, all can be solvent through the policies that political candidates pose and the choices our constituents make. In the endgame, our quality of turnout decides everything. But now, let's address one of the chief arguments of the negative, sponsored by Representative Jordan, who advocates that voters should choose whether or not they participate in elections. Your entire advocacy is contingent on the fact that in the affirmative world, people are just as incentivized to learn political issues and vote as in the status quo, which is categorically not true. In fact, ultimately, this legislation will incline people to make informed decisions when they vote. A poll conducted in New Hampshire states that literally everyone in the state wanted to hear about issues concerning the well-being of their lives and not the media madness circling around the president when they went into vote in the 2020 presidential election. Ultimately, more voter appreciation through their involvement in their process increases our constituency ability to vote. While the choices our citizens make change our jobs, one choice today defines.
Thank you, Representative Bopana, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Jordan and Representative Fay.
Representative, you stated in your speech that this bill isn't constitutional because it will incline people to make more decisions. Sure, that might tackle down the freedom of speech part, let's just say. But what about people whose religions literally do not let them vote?
First of all, I never said anything about constitutionality in my speech. And second of all, it's not even within our jurisdiction. It's not even within our jurisdiction to decide constitutionality.
You mentioned me by name talking about constitutionality and how
No,
this
I
bill.
mentioned you the fact that you decided that voting is a right. And
Representative Fay.
Okay, hi, Representative. How are the policies of these politicians going to be more representative of their constituents' wishes if both Representatives Chen and I have proven to you that the people who need to be represented won't be able to access these votes under today's legislation?
Obviously, there's a lot of state policies that can be made to fix that situation, i.e. like increasing the amount of ballot boxes within cities.
Okay, right, but Representatives Chen and I have literally proved that you're directly worsening today's legislation, the situation under this legislation with no guarantee.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech and affirmation, I now call for a speech and negation. Is there such a speech? Representative Shetty, you raise your placard unopposed.
The chair, this is Representative Shetty, spelled S-H-E-T-T-Y. This will be my second and last time speaking in the session. As always, PO and judges, just let me know when you're ready for me to begin. Is anyone not ready for me to begin? U.S. democracy is a mirror of American opinion. Americans bring their battles to the ballot box, and we, as Congress, make policy for them. I'll admit it, the mirror isn't spotless, but this bill threatens to completely shatter it. There are two types of voters we have to worry about in the status quo. One, marginalized voters, people who can't vote, and second, conscientious objectors, people who do not want to vote. It is because this bill violates both groups' freedom we fail. First, let's talk about these marginalized groups. Representative Chen and Fay tell us how more debilitating barriers exist that forces constituents to pay a $150 fine. Now, Mr. Wu and Ms. Kumar, even if you take away just one barrier, this bill adds another one. Representative Bopana, remember, minorities don't vote because they can't vote. They won't become more informed because Representative Halfman has already proved we can't guarantee any increase of get out the vote programs. That's $150 going to the government when it should be spent on people's groceries. But let's impact it, because what actually happens is that we as Congress underperform. To every affirmative speaker, the reason why you're advocating for appropriate representation is because you assume we're going to pass more appropriate policy. But if anything, if we pass, we operate under the assumption we're accounting for minority votes. But a 2012 study in the Journal of Representative Democracy explains that in reality, Congress would continue to ignore the most oppressed Americans. We pass even more ineffective legislation and pretend to be helpful. To the affirmative, we don't see helpful policies ever come to fruition. And problems like poverty continue to be policy choices. But second, let's consider conscientious objectors, which leads me to my second contention, that mandatory voting just means mandatory attendance. Representative Jordan tells us that people do not want to vote, and she's absolutely right. We can't infringe on their freedom. But the harm is that forcing the population to vote results in an increased number of invalid, random, or blank votes. In July 2012, Bloomberg estimated that this illegitimate votes could account to 5% of the total votes. Sure, that number might seem small, but let's compare it to the US 2016 presidential election. The New York Times reported that in swing states, the margin was less than 1%, which means just a small percentage of these random votes, which we're going to see, could sway the election completely. The worst impact of this bill is that we create illegitimate elections. Representative Ramachandra, you worry that the public is losing trust in the election, but just because more people participate does not mean they will be voting in their true opinion. Turn your point to the negation, because public distrust and quality of elections would decrease in the affirmative world. Representative Mukherjee and Wu, we end up electing someone who has no mandate from the people to govern. It dilutes true votes. Democracies are legitimate because they respect rights and because they allow choice. Mandatory voting violates both. Let's go back to the framework given. We ignore marginalized voters and elect a dishonorable government. The affirmative fails on every metric. Remember the mirror between us. It is so clear why we have to fail.
Thank you, Representative Shetty, for that 2-minute and 59-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Shaw and Representative Ramachandra.
Representative, why can't we operate under the idea that we're incorporating the opinions of minorities and marginalized populations? Slowly, won't their opinions become incorporated into our policy?
No, so that's when I said it in the beginning, what Representative Chen, Fay, and Halfman all have proven to you already. Just because you force them to vote doesn't mean they're actually going to end up vote, because there are so many barriers aside from just having to work that will prevent them from working. In fact, you make their lives even worse when you put that fine on them of $150.
But when we pass today's legislation, hasn't it been brought up that we're increasing education and accessibility to these polling locations?
No, because Ms. Halfman again proves that we don't provide funding for
Representative Ramachandra.
Thank you.
Hi, Representative. So you talked about how we're removing the aspect of choice, but can people that still go to vote submit blank ballots?
Sure. So I'm not really arguing about that. I'm talking about the impact. When you force people who don't want to vote, you force them to put random invalid ballots that just mess up the election. Even if these ballots only account for about 5% of the total votes, remember how close the margins of our elections are.
But why do people just submit invalid ballots?
Because they don't believe in voting. We've already seen that
So
happen.
they purposefully skew
Thank
the
you,
process.
Representative. Seeing as that was a speech of negation, I now call for a speech and affirmation. Is there such a speech? Representative Vade, you have the floor.
This is Representative Vade speaking for the second time this session. I'm just going to be timing myself. And if anyone isn't ready, I'll wait 5 to 10 seconds. Otherwise, I'll just begin. If you aren't ready, just give me a verbal indication. In ancient Athens, each decision was made through a direct vote. Each citizen not only felt part of the system, but saw the direct results of the things they voted on and they believed in. Now we have lost some of that in our own government today, and that's why I'm so proud to be on the affirmation. The two main points of today's debate are first, the potential impacts of people not being able to vote, and second, the effects on voting itself. But first, I want to look at the potential impacts of people not being able to vote. Representative Chen began today's debate by talking about the hurdles people face in actually voting. As the debate progressed, things like voter ID laws, Representative Fay's rural infrastructure, and the way Halfman described short-term infrastructure problems all were shown as problems in actually getting people to vote. Let me explain to you why the problem in each of their arguments and why the potential barriers without actually looking at what currently stops them from voting is irrelevant. Let me provide you the foundation in today's debate that the negation lacks. Under the status quo, younger voters are the largest demographic who struggle to vote. According to The Atlantic, the average voting gap between the youngest and oldest age groups in Iowa, Georgia, and Delaware was 41.3% in 2018. But what's the reason these people can't vote? The slate best describes why this happened when they say you're less likely to have the ability to find flexible employment and less likely to have the confidence to participate in the political process. Our young people can't say that a month down the line they'll be free to vote, so they don't vote. This legislation fundamentally changes that narrative by addressing their main concern for missing out on employment. To illustrate how the negations mainly impacts deal with the potential hurdles versus what's actually happening on the ground, I'm going to address the negation's concern about voter ID laws. A study from Enrico Cantoni from the University of Bologna and Vincent Pons and from Harvard Business School found that voter ID laws don't decrease voter turnout, including that of minority votes, nor do they have a detectable effect on voter fraud, which is extremely rare in the US in the first place. The implication of this is that despite the legal and political battles over voter ID laws, they don't seem to do much of anything. The reason voter suppression laws fundamentally do not work is that people are not blind to these laws. Every time they go into action, public mobilization neutralizes the effects of these laws. Don't make the decision to negate when previous questioning on potential harms. Do it on real world impacts. But next, let's look at the effects of today's legislation on voting itself. The negation has been unable to find any ground in the debate on the grounds of voter turnout. Fundamentally, this bill increases participation. Speaker by speaker, the affirmation has proven this, from Representative Mukherjee, who advocated for felons, to Representative Ramachandra, who spoke for the moderate voter, who would now be able to be part of the election process. Representative Wu indisputably asserted that we we'd be able to help Black and brown minorities who have been fighting for the right to vote. Representative Kumar ties this together by illustrating how rural Americans would now be able to vote. Representatives, this is the 21st century. It seems this Congress wants to debate issues that were solved by ancient civilizations. Don't do that. Solve real.
Thank you, Representative, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Shetty and Representative Halfman.
How do we improve minority voter turnout if we still are going to see the same problems of them facing other barriers outside of not being able to miss work?
Right. So the problem is that you guys assume that every time they have this barrier, it's like a fundamental barrier that's not that's immovable. The only thing that's stopping them, the biggest thing that's stopping them is unemployment. And the other thing is that when there are physical barriers that stop them, public mobilization neutralizes those barriers.
Sure, but doesn't Representative Halfman already prove that there's no funding in this bill that provides funds for other nonprofits to fund those get out the vote movement?
Representative Halfman.
Right. So can you tell me how we're ensuring that businesses can afford to compensate their workers for this?
Right. So the important thing to understand is that any time there's a barrier to voting, public mobilization means that these issues are addressed by state and federal government laws.
Right. So you're saying that states will suddenly start funding businesses and give them grants to compensate?
Right. If they're struggling the status quo and some kind of small amount is going to cause them to go under for paying.
Thank you, Representative. Seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for a speech in negation. Is there such a speech? Representative Saxena, you raise your placard unopposed.
All right. Hi, everyone. Is there any judge that's not ready? Okay, cool. Then for the last time ever in Illinois, this is Representative Saxena. All right. 4 years ago, I took the oath of office and promised to defend the Constitution of the United States and our democracy. Today, as I get ready to retire from the Illinois House, 2 months after the most egregious attack on American democracy, I'm more committed than ever than staying towards that same goal. Fittingly, this last piece of legislation is exactly what propelled me to office, of how we vote. Ultimately, it's because mandatory voting is only going to hurt our democracy that you fail. I agree with Mr. Vide that we increase voter turnout when we pass, but fundamentally, that doesn't mean that's a good thing. And that's the problem with the affirmation's entire advocacy, because mandatory voting doesn't fix the problem behind why people don't vote in the status quo, because they feel like they don't have the agency to make change or that their vote doesn't matter. As Pew Research Center explains in March 2016, 50% of non-voters didn't even research the election because they didn't think that their vote impacted the government. That apathy doesn't change under a mandatory voting system, because when voter apathy doesn't change, it also doesn't mean that voters will be any more likely to research the policies behind each candidate because they still don't believe that they can actually make a difference in our elections. Mr. Ramachandra, you talked about how our elections are going to become more competitive, and that's exactly the case. But when apathetic voters still aren't going to research the policies behind the candidates, they're going to be increasingly susceptible to false claims and sensationalized media. The end impact of that is that we propel radical candidates to the White House. And that's because, as Regina Lawrence, the executive director of the Agora Journalism Center, explains in 2019, as hard as it is to believe, the biggest thing that drives elections is simple name recognition. Mr. Ramachandra, under your framework of increased competitiveness, that's especially the case, meaning that name recognition becomes even more important in such massive fields. But that's a bad thing, because what drives name recognition is media coverage. The media is more likely to cover radical candidates because their actions are simply just more newsworthy. And that's so unproblematic because voters as a whole are unlikely to fact check their claims. According to a report by Signal Labs in 2020, 1 out of 4 Americans don't fact check the information that they share, especially when it's shared by a friend. That means that radical candidates are more likely to be propelled into office because when we introduce 140 million more voters into our electorate, those who had previously not been engaged, they're only going to make their votes off of that same premise. Ms. Mukherjee, I agree that this bill is a benefit for workers and that it gives felons voting rights, but an uneducated electorate voting has to outweigh those impacts because the result of uneducated voters affect every single person in the United States. I don't want what happened 2 months ago because voters were so susceptible to false claims to become a repeated instance in our democracy.
Thank you, Representative, for that 3-minute speech. And I'll call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Bopana and Representative Shaw.
Thank you. If I prove to you in my speech that we increase the amount of political education these people get when they go to the ballot, how is that not an incentive for these people to make the right decision?
So the problem is that your side is kind of contradicting right now. Mr. Ramachandra said that we're going to increase competitiveness. If we're increasing competitiveness by increasing like how the scale of how many like candidates there are, that means that each voter is more susceptible to each candidate's outreach. Just because there's more education, because of the increased size of the field, that doesn't mean that's a good
Representative Shaw.
Representative, it's been brought up in this debate previously that individuals and campaigns are going to save money on advertising to get people to the polls. Isn't it likely to assume that money is then fed into explaining a person's policy?
Okay, so personally, I don't agree that we're going to save money, because when everybody has to vote, that means that campaigns have to spend more money on making sure that the 150 million Americans that didn't vote before are going to vote for them now. That
Thank you,
only
Representative.
increases
Seeing as that was a speech in negation, I now call for a speech in affirmation. Is there such a speech? Representative Gandhi, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. This is Representative Gandhi speaking for the second and final time in my debate career, actually. So at the leisure of all those above me, please give me any indication when you're ready. Awesome. Is there anybody who's not ready? Great. Abraham Lincoln once said that the ballot is stronger than the bullet. We've had bullets fired at us, Representative, on January 6th during the Capitol Hill riots. Let's pass this bill, however, and protect ourselves with those bullets, with something stronger, the votes of the people. Representatives, affirm with me today to protect both us and the people for the following two contentions: that one, that this bill decreases qualified votes and it decreases disqualified votes, and two, that this bill will promote policies that help those in need. But first, understand how this bill has impacts further than just those who don't vote, on those who do vote and are disqualified. Now, Representative Fay said that under this bill, people will be required to go in person to vote. And that is true. Now, but however, this is ultimately a point that falls to the affirmation, because Science Monitor says in 2017 that about 400,000 mail-in ballots were never counted because they were either late, had invalid signatures, or dozens of petty reasons. On top of this, The Atlantic says in 2020 that it's mostly the rural and older constituents who are using these mail-in ballots and having them not counted. Now, Representative Fay, you talked about how rural constituents can't go and vote because of issues like transportation, but the Rural Health Information Hub says in 2018 that most rural populations rely on public transport to get around instead of personal vehicles, meaning they do still have this transportation. So, Representative Fay, these people are currently having their votes disqualified and not having a say in our elections even after they vote. However, by passing this bill, instead of restricting their access to vote and fining them, we're going to allow them to use this public transportation to go to these in-person polls and go and vote. Representative Halfman, you talk about how 2022 isn't enough time to develop the infrastructure to track these votes, but understand that ultimately there's constituents in the status quo who are voting and not having their votes counted. And ultimately, it's a net benefit if we can have their votes counted. And Representative Saxena, let's look beyond just those people who are uninformed and understand that people in the status quo who want to vote, who are informed, are not having their votes counted, and thus we must affirm. But second, affirm with me because this bill promotes policies that help those in need. Now, The Atlantic says in 2015 that people who don't vote in the status quo are more in support of programs that help those in need and reduce income inequality.
So by passing this bill, we encourage those voters to go and vote and support these policies. Representative Chen, you talk about how this bill will force constituents to pay high fines and on not having voter IDs. But The Atlantic says in 2014 that most polls accept driver's licenses, which cost only $15 to $60. On top of this, by affirming this bill, we can help these very constituents who can't afford these voter IDs to pass legislation that is ultimately going to help them. Representative Shetty, you talk about how Congress will oppress the minorities further.
Thank you, Representative, for that
passing this bill
3-minute
helps
speech.
them.
Thank you, Representative, for that 3-minute speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placard. Representative Rubis and Representative Saxena.
I read you a card in my speech that said in 30 countries, mandatory voting did nothing to increase representation of minorities. Even if more people turn out, why does it matter?
So as I showed through my evidence, the people who don't vote are more in support of helping, the people who don't vote are more in support of reducing inequalities that minorities face. And thus, if these people are voting, they're going to be voting for the candidates who are in support of these policies.
So in the 30 other countries where this policy was tried, why did that not happen then?
Well, this might not have been true, that most people who don't vote are in
Representative
support
Saxena.
Hi. So if in my speech I prove to you that people who don't vote on majority do so because they don't want to, why would you weigh your points over why would you weigh your points as more important?
Representative, just because they don't want to doesn't mean that they don't have an obligation to vote. If these people are ultimately going to be helping those who are in need and reducing inequality, then I think that's a net
How are
benefit.
they going to be helping those that are in need if they are the people that are in need and are
Thank you,
disenfranchised
Representative.
without-
Seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, I now call for a speech in negation. Negation speakers, please raise your placard. Representative Reddy, you have the floor.
I thank the chair. This is Laya Reddy speaking as the last speaker of this round and likely the last speech of today. As always, I'm at the leisure of all those above me, so please give me any indication when you're ready. Awesome. Great, great, awesome. The affirmation today have fancied themselves to be like King Arthur and his knights as they try to vanquish low voter turnout with noble intentions. But in their quest, they have let the walls of Camelot fall as they ruin voter accessibility, negate. Principally, the end of absentee voting will devastate voter turnout. So absentee balloting or mail-in voting is when voters mail in ballots from outside the polling area. Now, this was brought up briefly by Mr. Fay in his rural access argument, but I want to address exactly why we need absentee voting right now. And that's because there's a variety of reasons it's engaged with. It could be disability, hospitalization, jury duty. In fact, according to the Washington Post in August of 2020, absentee voting has been commonplace in 34 states, such that you don't even need a reason for it now. So when minorities and poor workers can't afford to vote and wait in line, they have options, Ms. Mukherjee. So you don't need to buy the argument that the affirmation is selling today. But then it also makes voting much more accessible. And that's especially evident now because according to Pew Research Center in November of 2020, 46% of Americans voted by absentee ballots this year. So essentially we're already shifting to absentee balloting that this bill undermines. And this is problematic because an MIT election lab found in 2020, voting by mail causes turnout to increase up to 10% compared to when there's only traditional poll options. So essentially accessibility to the vote decreases because compulsory voting is a step backward from voting practices that encourage involvement. But it's not just regressive, it's also harmful because it increases election fraud. In comparison to physical voting, absentee voting has been found to be much more secure, Mr. Gandhi. That's why we keep with it. According to the Election Registration Information Center in 2020, they found that instances of voter fraud for 14.6 million cases cast in the 2016 and 2018 general elections was 0.0025%. Essentially, the American voter has been finding more accessible and secure methods of casting their ballots, but we on Capitol Hill are supporting flawed alternatives. But finally, I want to address the major affirmative claim that still stands, which is that representation increases. And this is contingent on the fact that the voter population will become more educated, but that's false because Jill Shepard of the London School of Economics in January 2016 finds that enforced compulsory voting reduces the direct effects of formal education on political knowledge as well as mitigates the gender gap in political knowledge. So essentially, when you find that this education is not really happening, then you are more susceptible to what the negation has been telling you about, where polarized voting, corporate influences all thrive. So when the affirmation tries to impact to progressive candidates, to somehow greater representation of minorities, this doesn't happen now or in the long term. Essentially, while the affirmation has been chasing their holy grail, we in the negation know the cost to American voters. Negate.
Thank you, Representative, for that 2-minute and 55-second speech. I now call for questioners. Questioners, please raise your placards. Representative Gandhi and Representative Chen.
Hey, Representative, so how are absentee ballots more secured if they're disqualified at higher rates?
Okay, so first of all, voter fraud, when you compare absentee voting to traditional polling, it's better. That's why we moved to absentee voting.
Okay, how much voter fraud happens in normal polling versus absentee voting?
I believe that when you're talking about, votes being counted multiple times, that's much more common in polling places compared to absentee voting, but I don't have an exact statistic.
Okay, sure. So if absentee ballots are literally disqualifying people's votes, doesn't that mean that we suppress their voices when they're trying to show it?
No, I don't believe that's true, because a recent 2020
Representative Chen.
What makes a voter educated or uneducated?
I'm saying that the impacts of voter education won't actually combat the polarization and corporate influence that my side has been warning you about. That's the problem.
Right, but why should we weigh an educated voter above an uneducated one? Why shouldn't they both be?
Because they are more likely to actually look into policies and get you that moderate vote that the affirmation has been championing.
Should someone with a college degree have more of a voice than someone without one?
No, it's not a traditional education, it's a voting education.
Thank you,
they know more about what's
Representative.
going on.
Seeing as that is the last speaker, this bill automatically goes to previous questions. So we will vote on Bill 302 at this time. A bill to make voting mandatory. All in favor of passing Bill 302, please raise your placards. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have another tie of 8-8. I feel like Joe Manchin. I am going to vote in affirmation, and this bill passes 9-8. Congratulations for passing 2 bills today, everyone. Motion, Representative Gandhi.
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
There is a second. All in favor of adjourning, please raise your placards. All right, it is unanimous. We will adjourn at this time. Congratulations, everyone. Thank you very much, judges. Way to go. It was a interesting season, but really cool that we were able to do this still. All right.
Can I just tell you guys before you go, I think this was the most impressive round of debate I have ever seen in just so many ways. I think this is going to be one of the most difficult rounds I have ever judged, because you guys have made this like near impossible, which I think says so much about your intelligence, but not only that, your resiliency in such an incredibly difficult year. All of you should be so incredibly proud of yourself. And I don't think I've ever been as happy to be as part of this activity as I am now. Thank you. Thank you for your dedication. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your late nights, working hard. Thank you for being kind to each other. Just thank you.
There has been a request to sing to Miss Halfman. We can do that real quickly, and then the judges need to get about their work. So I will allow it. Mr. Gandhi, you can lead us.
Awesome. 3, 2, 1.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Jimmy.
I'm a
Happy birthday to you. Let's go.
Happy birthday.
Wait, Representative Halfman, are you 18?
I am.
That means you can vote.
Hey,
Oh, man.
go to the polls.
Register.
All right, congratulations, everyone. If you could sign out now, I would appreciate it. Congratulations again.
Thank you, judges.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Judges for